What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was thrown away as a child, but came back as the master of the void style? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description box to original creator of this beautiful creation. Somewhere in the galaxy, on a distant planet, thousands of light years from Earth, a ship could be seen approaching. For generations, you've slept, no purpose, no call to wake you. A soft, feminine voice spoke, but now, something has risen from the ruins of the old war. As the voice spoke, the ship began to land on the surface of the planet that was currently in its night cycle with heavy rain, while the planet seemed to consist of a vast jungle. However, among the jungle were giant metal fences, metal walkways, and containers of varying sizes. As the ship finished landing, several figures began to jump out. However, they didn't look normal. A majority of them looked to be wearing overly round, metal armor to cover their torsos and go above their heads, with their legs and arms having very little armor to allow for easy movement while they carried arms, showing they were a form of soldier. However, the last one to exit looked to be the most odd, as the figure's legs looked to not even be made of flesh but metal and moving parts. Not only that, but they didn't wear the same style of armor like the others, as it looked to have metal cylinders popping out at random from the thighs. The entire armor set was a deep crimson color, with the left shoulder being far larger than the right, while the neck was navy blue with no mask, showing that it was a man. The man's face was an ugly, chalk white color with wrinkles, scars, and sunspots. The man only had one orange eye with black sclera, while the other was replaced with a mechanical lens that also glowed orange. As the main figure began walking, completely ignoring the heavy rain, another ran up and began shouting in an unknown language, "You shouldn't be here, old man. This is my prize." However, despite yelling at the older figure, the one that came running went ignored, as the older looked around with a sneer on their face. Not liking that they were ignored, the younger figure shoved the older figure as they exclaimed, "Are you listening to me?" However, in response to this, the older figure's face scrunched up in anger, making them look even uglier as their wrinkles became more pronounced before they pushed the other one back. They then followed up by throwing something at the person that stuck to their chest, as it covered the figure's body in electricity, as they were shocked into unconsciousness. As they fell to their back, the older figure walked past them as he looked over his shoulder to the soldiers that he arrived with and said, "Let's go." With that, they began to walk through the jungle on the metal walkways before the scene rapidly began moving through the jungle as the mysterious voice continued speaking. The twin queens, the sisters, have sent their most beloved commander, Vor, on an urgent mission. The scene shows a portal made of strange energy being opened before traveling through to another area, now within a worn-down building, as seen by the open roof that allowed the heavy rain to fall through, with plants that grew with glowing, blue energy within the roots. Meanwhile, in the middle of the air, was a gold and blue-colored pod, while the voice continued. To protect the twisted crusade they have begun. To transform the scattered colonies into an empire. To see that the Tenno, hidden and asleep, will never awaken. As the mysterious voice spoke, the old figure from before walked in front of the portal before calling out, "Bring it here." Suddenly, two soldiers brought over a device that they placed in front of the portal before moving away. The old figure then walked over to the device before taking something off his chest that he then placed into the device, as yellow energy began to enter and corrupt the portal. Meanwhile, on the other side of the portal, the pod opened up to reveal a figure inside that was very much a male, based on their physical build. They were 6 feet in height, with their bodies seeming to be covered in an odd, black-colored armor which twisted and melded at the arms, starting from just past the shoulder before ending in pointed fingers. The legs were also covered in armor, while the feet looked almost like ninja tabi. The figure also had a black hood that was currently down but seemed to come from somewhere underneath the armor, while their head was a smooth, black dome with a metal gray mask that would have covered the nose and mouth. Warframe's ash, with the body being the Tsukuyomi skin, the head being the normal ash head, and then the hood from the shroud skin. As the pod fully opened, the figure dropped while the mysterious voice said, "Wake up, Tenno." The figure dropped to the floor, landing on their hands and knees, showing no signs of injury aside from being weak as they struggled to stand up. The figure continued to try and stand up, while the old figure and his soldiers from before finally walked through the portal, guns facing the figure that just fell from the pod and was struggling to get up. However, the old figure shoved 2 soldiers out of his way as he spoke, his voice gravelly and rough, like rocks grinding against each other. "I see the Lotus has tried to wake you, pity she's too late." He then pulled out a yellow and gray device as he walked closer to the weakened figure and said, "You're my prize now, Tenno." Seeing the device, the figure slowly begins inching away, still too weakened, but begins feeling strength fill their body as they stand a bit easier and begin backing up. Suddenly, the mysterious voice speaks again, "I can't lose another Tenno. I'm surging your Warframe's power systems." Suddenly, the figure felt a massive rush of energy as they jumped in the air as they exuded a bright flash of light and a pulse of air that caused all the soldiers and the old figure to fly back a bit while falling. The figure then fell back to the ground, standing tall and proud to show their full height before they began looking at their hands in what could be seen as apparent shock as the figure clenched and opened their hands repeatedly. As the older figure stood back up, a sneer marring his face once more, he pointed at the one who'd sent out the pulse of energy and shouted, "Get him! But do not damage him too badly." With that, the other soldiers began standing back up while reinforcements began coming from the portal, while the figure from the pod was confused and didn't know what was going on. However, they knew that they needed to get away from all these soldiers before they were captured. With that thought, they began running towards all the soldiers, bobbing and weaving between the bullets being fired before they launched themselves through the air, spinning as they flew and strayed through the portal. An extraction ship is on its way. The figure heard the mysterious voice once again, "But the Grineer will be hunting you. Arm yourself." Now knowing that the soldiers were known as Grineer, the figure kept running, seeing old, destroyed ships all around and even burning wreckage in the distance. As they kept running, they suddenly saw something glowing white in the hollow of a massive tree. Running over, he found a container of sorts that was mainly a dark gray with gold accents while it had bits of white in the center with the lights glowing white. As they approached the container, the lights began to glow slightly brighter before it slowly opened. Approaching the now open container, they found that it held a bunch of weapons inside. Among the weapons, they found a set of scythes about the length of their arm that was a mix of dark gray and regular gray with a light blue glow lining. Placing those on their back, they continued looking before finding a small container that looked to be made of a dark gray, metal-like material. Tapping the top, they were surprised when it opened to reveal a surprisingly large amount of shuriken for the size of the container. Taking one out, they looked it over, noting that there were only 3 points to each shuriken while the shuriken were made of a mix of dark gray, dark blue, and white metal with gold accents and small lights glowing a white-blue color in the center. Putting the shuriken back, they tightened the container onto their right thigh before taking out the last weapon inside the container. They instantly recognized the last weapon as a gun, with the main body being dark gray with small parts being colored white on the stock and near the safety switch. Aside from that, it had small lights that glowed a white-blue color, the same as the shuriken. Not only that, but it had a gold carrying handle that extended from the end of the stock to just before the gold front sight. To finish, it had a gold handguard that extended from the bottom of the grip and past the barrel of the gun, acting as a sort of dual handguard and bayonet. Before the figure could continue going over the gun, they jumped as bullets began hitting the container, the tree, or even flying close enough that the whizzing sound from the bullets could be heard. Looking back, they could see that the soldiers from before had caught up and immediately continued running through the jungle while placing the gun on their back with the scythes. As they ran, they noticed that these Grineer had begun setting up a sort of base of operations in the jungle as they saw tables with ammunition, barrels of fuel, computers within these odd, pill-shaped containers that would have been big enough for one to stand inside. As they kept running, they felt bullets impacting their body, slightly shoving them from the force, but left no damage as a light blue aura appeared wherever they were shot. Seeing this, they figured they must have had some sort of shield, but didn't want to guess how much it could withstand, so they continued running. As they ran, not only did they feel more bullets hitting them, they found themselves coming to a gap in the floor, signs of a bridge previously having been there but was now destroyed. Knowing they needed to cross, they swiftly jumped in the air while spinning around to face the Grineer soldiers. As they reached their apex, they swiftly reached for the pouch, surprised it was already open and offering shuriken, but didn't question it. Grabbing a handful, they began skillfully throwing shuriken back at the Grineer, hitting each one in the head, in the arms, preventing them from using their guns anymore, or even directly at the gun, destroying or jamming them. With that, they let themselves continue spinning back around, finally over the gap and already falling back to the ground, before they fell into a roll and continued running. As they ran, they found themselves running through an old village, currently burning to the ground, despite the heavy rain while the voice spoke, "Good, but you need to hurry, oh, Tion." However, as they were talking, the voice began breaking with heavy static before they were suddenly cut off, with nothing but silence filling the figure's head aside from the sound of the rain. Trying to reach out to the mysterious voice, but receiving nothing but static, the figure kept moving, not wanting to get caught by these Grineer. As they kept running, they came to a large clearing aside from a tree in the center and saw a ship approach. However, as it began to land, a beam of yellow energy shot through the ship, causing it to crash into the tree, taking it down while the ship crashed. As they watched the ship crash, they saw the cause was the old Grineer from before, holding some sort of device in their hand that was radiating the yellow energy that blew through the ship. He looked at them before sneering out, "My decrepit heart is pounding. This one is stronger than the rest." Suddenly, he exclaimed, "Lock the area down. This one is mine." As the old Grineer began walking towards the figure again, they looked around before noticing an area full of ships nearby and ran straight there. Seeing where they were going, the old Grineer exclaimed, "The Tenno is heading for the ships. Stop them." However, just as he'd finished giving the order, the Tenno had finally made it and entered one of the ships, which appeared to be a normal transport ship of sorts. Quickly heading to they sat in the chair before they began turning on the ship while closing the doors. After a minute, they began to take off, as the ship began to fly into the air. However, the Tenno's relief wasn't long as bullets began hitting the ship, getting the Tenno to look and see several Grineer had arrived and were firing at the ship while the old Grineer was shouting, "Take down that ship. We cannot let the Tenno escape." Seeing the danger they were in, the Tenno began focusing on getting the ship airborne, ignoring the flashing lights and alarm that the ship was now experiencing heavy damage. Eventually, they'd finally managed to pull the ship away, the bullets no longer reaching the ship, but it didn't matter as the ship had now been heavily damaged, as evidenced by how shaky and difficult the ship was to control now. As the ship flew into space, no longer hindered by the planet's gravity or atmosphere, the Tenno looked around, seeing all the flashing lights before spotting a handle behind some glass with a metal tile that spelled, "Reliquary Drive." Seeing this, and figuring the situation couldn't be any worse, the Tenno slammed their hand through the glass, grabbing the handle as they yanked it up, causing another alarm to ring as an automated voice now spoke, "Warning, you are attempting to activate the reliquary drives with heavy damage to the ship. It is under advisement that you not activate the reliquary drives." Whatever else the automated voice was going to say went unsaid as the Tenno twisted the handle and slammed it back in, causing the ship to shoot forward at blinding speeds, causing the stars to begin stretching due to the sudden increase in speed. As the ship flew through space, the Tenno began to relax, letting the ship fly its course. However, the Tenno was only allowed a brief respite as the ship began heavily shaking while the alarms came back, blaring in full volume, as they jumped into action and grabbed the controls while the ship also stopped its warp speed. As the Tenno held the control, trying to regain control with the heavily resistant controls, they noticed they were drawing closer to a planet. The planet, from their current distance, was mostly blue with water, but they could make out the white areas to be clouds. Then, they noticed the various patches of land covering the surface while they continued their crash course towards the planet. However, with what little control the Tenno could wrestle back, they began to try and aim the ship to crash in one of the many large patches of land, but were unsuccessful as they continued heading towards the water. As they continued trying to fight against the controls, they looked at the joints that controlled the ship's engines that allowed it to turn and noticed something was lodged inside. Seeing this, the Tenno broke the glass causing a massive rush of wind to begin buffeting the Tenno, but they went mostly unaffected as they looked at the piece of metal currently jamming the controls while pulling some shuriken out from the container. They then began throwing shuriken after shuriken at the metal piece to try and get it out of the way. At first, all the shuriken kept flying in a wild pattern and would miss the piece of metal. However, after adjusting to the wind, the Tenno began hitting the metal perfectly as they noticed the shuriken were actually cutting into the metal. Eventually, they managed to cut the piece in half as it fell away from the joint, getting the Tenno to swiftly sit back in the chair as they grabbed the controls and yanked them, the controls now easily giving way, even if still shaking a lot. With that, the Tenno was able to balance out the ship, but was still heading on a crash course for the planet, no longer able to stay in the air after all the damage done to the ship. However, as they fought to stay in the air, they noticed a small island in the distance. Seeing this, and not wanting to crash into the water, the Tenno turned the ship, aiming it straight for the island, unaware that he'd just caught the attention of the island's inhabitants. Meanwhile, on the island of Themyscira, land of the Amazons, Paradise Island, Themyscira. These are some of the names the island has gone by. However, to the inhabitants, it goes by another name. Home. The island of Themyscira was the home to a race of warrior women known as the Amazons. They live and train on the island, uninhibited by outside influences from man's world, as they call it. To them, men are greedy, deceptive, and cruel. Thus, they refuse to interact with the outside world, not wanting to reveal themselves, and also so that they cannot be influenced by them. Since it was the middle of the day, a majority of them were near the center of the island, training with their swords, shields, spears, and bows. Some were even in a sort of arena, training their hand-to-hand combat skills against each other. However, even if they were training, they still remained vigilant, as seen by the patrols they carried out along the edges of the island. In fact, it was one such patrol that was currently walking along the beach that noticed something rapidly approaching them. Looking at the object, they noticed it to be smoking and on approach to their island. Turning to one another, one of them spoke, quickly. "Go alert everyone, we have something headed straight for the island." With that, the other members of the group quickly ran back, planning to follow the orders given while the last stayed in place with her spear in hand and sword at her hip. Not even a minute after she gave the order, the object came flying over her head, before slamming into the cliffside in an explosion. Seeing this, the last Amazon from the patrol unit couldn't help but think that if her two subordinates hadn't alerted everyone yet, the sound of the explosion certainly would have. After a few minutes, all the Amazons came running, some on foot, others on horseback, but all armed to the teeth with spears, swords, shields, and bows, while all donned leather armor. Suddenly, two Amazons from the group approached the Amazon who'd stayed behind, both on white horses while the Amazon kneeled. Before her were two fellow Amazons, both with tan, smooth skin, as was normal for their race due to all the time they spent training in the sun. The one in front was wearing a white dress that hugged her F-cup S with a line of gold near the bottom and a white toga on top with a gold belt around her waist. She also wore a set of gold armbands, a gold necklace, and white slippers, while a white cape hung off her shoulder with gold clips holding it in place. To finish, she was wearing a gold crown on top of her head, placed neatly in her black locks, while she stared at the Amazon with her blue eyes. To her right, sat an Amazon who also had black hair and blue eyes, but she wore a normal set of leather armor that looked very snug with her E-cup S pushing against the armor, while she had sandals like all the other Amazons. On her hip was a sword, while she also held a spear in her right hand. "What is going on? What is that?" asked the woman wearing the dress. "I am unsure, my lady," replied the kneeling Amazon. "Me and my subordinates were doing our routine patrol of the beach when suddenly, we spotted this unknown object coming towards the island. Immediately, I sent them to warn and retrieve everyone when it flew over my head and smashed into the cliff before exploding." Just as the lady in the dress was going to speak again, all of them heard creaking and looked to see the craft, which was now smoking heavily and on fire, began to lean backwards, dislodging itself from the cliff. Seeing this, the lady in the dress turned and shouted, "Move back. It's going to fall." At this, all the Amazons quickly backed away just as the object finally dislodged from the cliff and fell before smashing into the sand, sending a wave of sand into the air that quickly fell back down. Seeing that it was no longer moving, the Amazons readied their swords and spears as they approached the unknown object, while the woman in the dress and the one behind her got off their horses. The two who got off the white horses stood as they let the other Amazons approach the destroyed object. However, just as the Amazons were getting close enough, a large and warped piece of metal began moving, getting all the Amazons to raise their guards as they pointed their weapons towards the moving piece with their shield up and ready to protect themselves, as they've trained to do so. Meanwhile, the woman who was with the lady in the dress moved up as well, drawing her sword with her other hand. Finally, the piece of metal stopped moving before it fell, revealing a shadowed figure that the Amazons couldn't make out due to the fire and smoke. Suddenly, the figure began slowly walking forward, swaying side to side, no doubt disoriented from the crash and explosion, before they fell forward, revealing themselves to the Amazons. Seeing that the person was clearly injured, the one who was standing with the woman in the dress quickly ran through the Amazons, heading straight for the fallen person while dropping her weapons. Diana. The woman in the dress shouted at the now named Diana, "Stop. We don't know if this is a trap." Diana, ignoring the woman, kneeled next to them, noting the weapons on their back, before turning them over so that they were now laying on their back. Quickly going over their body, she saw that the armor they wore didn't even have a scratch. However, she quickly noticed that they weren't breathing. "They aren't." Diana began to say that the figure wasn't breathing, however, she was cut off when they suddenly grabbed her arm, surprising her while the Amazons nearby quickly moved in, weapons ready to strike before Diana called out, "Wait." At this, all the Amazons stopped moving but didn't lower their guard while Diana looked at the figure and asked, "Hello? Can you hear me?" The figure turned their head towards Diana before nodding. Seeing this, Diana asked, "Can you stand?" At this, the figure let go of Diana's arm before, in a surprise move of acrobatics, they swiftly flipped themselves in the air, spinning a bit before they landed on their feet, the Amazons now seeing the weapons the figure held on their back and getting more on guard. The figure then looked to Diana before offering her a hand, which she took, as they helped her stand up. Before Diana could ask any more questions, the woman in the dress walked over, drawing their attention while the Amazons nearby kept their weapons trained on the unknown figure while the woman looked at Diana and said, "Diana, there is a limit to how reckless you can be." At this, Diana looked embarrassed as she said, "I apologize, mother." Diana's mother simply shook her head before saying, "Just come over here for now, I must talk with this person." At this, Diana moved back over to stand next to her mother, the figure not moving aside from turning their head to follow Diana as she walked over. Soon, her mother stepped forward, drawing the figure's attention as seen by their head shifting to look at her. "I am Hippolyta," the now named Hippolyta spoke, "Queen of the Amazons and ruler of this island. May I ask who you are?" At this, the figure's body language seemed to show they were surprised in some essence, with Hippolyta being unsure if it was because they expected an immediate attack or for some other unknown reason. After that, the figure appeared to be in thought for a minute, as if they were trying to think about what was going on and come up with a proper response. After about a minute, the figure looked back at Hippolyta as they began trying to speak. Ugh. However, instead of a response, what came out were the strangled sounds of a broken voice and strained vocal cords, as if they hadn't spoken for quite a long time. Hippolyta realized this and calmly said, "It's all right, just take your time." The figure nodded as they continued trying to talk for the next few minutes, with no success. However, after a while, they tried again, "My." At this, Hippolyta and the other Amazons were surprised by how quiet and gravelly the voice sounded, but let them talk as they were still getting their strength back into their vocal cords. "My name," the figure said again, their voice sounding a little smoother and louder as it continued to get better as they continued to talk. "My name is Ash," the now named Ash said, their voice now sounding like a young man as they fully responded, "My name is Ash." At this, Hippolyta nodded as she replied, "Well, it is nice to meet you, Ash. However, we have a rule for the Themyscira and it is that no man may set foot here. Now, you may either leave willingly, or you will be put to death, the choice is yours." At this, Ash tilted his head as he responded, "While I would not want to break any rules or impose, I do not know where I am." At this, one of the Amazons thought he was trying to be smart and exclaimed, "Are you an idiot? The queen has just said that you are on the island of the Themyscira, our home." Ash shook his head as he replied, "No, I understand that, however, I mean to say that I do not know the planet I am on." This was a response that stopped all the Amazons, as none of them knew how to respond to this. However, while the rest were unsure how to respond, Diana stepped forward and asked, "You mean to say that you came from the stars?" Ash chuckled as he crossed his arms and said, "No, I came from a different planet. I have just been awakened from a deep slumber and escaped from being captive to a race known as Grineer. Unfortunately, as I escaped, the ship I was on was damaged and couldn't handle a full jump through space, and so, I crash-landed here." At this, all the Amazons began chatting amongst each other, now looking between Ash and the destroyed ship, as he had called the object. They were now very curious as to what Ash could tell them, however, that thought was quickly suppressed as Hippolyta raised her hand, getting everyone to quiet down while she continued to look at Ash. "Well," Queen Hippolyta began, "seeing as you are not from this world, and you seem to have no ill intentions, I see no reason why you cannot stay here for a while so that you may learn what you can about this planet." "Thank you," Ash responded, "and yes, I mean you no harm. I simply wish to learn more about this world before you send me on my way." Queen Hippolyta nodded her head, understanding now that Ash was not a threat, simply a stranger to this world that wished to know more before setting off on their own. With a wave of her hand, all the Amazons simultaneously lowered their weapons, no longer poised to attack Ash at a moment's notice. "Now then, if you would please come with us," Queen Hippolyta said as she and Diane mounted their horses again while all the Amazons began walking back to the main area of the island. "We will show you the rest of the island and lend you any scrolls or books we have. Though, if it is all right with you, may please relinquish your weapons?" At this, Ash looked to see several Amazons still looking at him with suspicion in their eyes, more specifically, at his weapons on his back, and he said, "It's no problem. I understand that as your guest, it would be very impolite of me to stay armed." At this, Queen Hippolyta couldn't help but smile, seeing the courteousness Ash displayed as he removed the odd-looking weapon from his back, followed by a surprising pair of melee weapons in the form of dual scythes. However, her curiosity got the better of her as she noticed him removing the odd container on his thigh. "Ash," Queen Hippolyta called out, getting his attention as he was about to hand over the container, "if I may, what is that?" Seeing that she was looking at the container, Ash replied, "It's my shuriken holder." With that, he tapped the top, opening it before calmly walking over and handing it over to Hippolyta, who took it and looked inside before pulling one of the shuriken out. What oddly shaped weapons," Hippolyta said, as she looked over the shuriken before looking to Ash and asking, "How do you wield such a weapon?" "If I may," Ash said as he held his hand out, asking for the shuriken she currently held, which she handed over. "You use a shuriken by throwing them like this." With that, Ash quickly jumped and flipped through the air before throwing the shuriken into the air. Queen Hippolyta, Diana, and the few Amazons who stayed behind following it with their eyes. Ash then finished going through his flip as he landed on the ground, the Amazons returning their attention to him while he then held his hand out and caught a bird that fell into his hand, the shuriken firmly lodged in the bird's chest. He then handed over the bird, shuriken and all, as Diana exclaimed, "So it's a type of throwing knife?" Ash nodded as he replied, "Yes, but shuriken were designed to be deadlier than a normal throwing knife as they were designed without a handle so that more blades can be added, making them far more deadly than a normal throwing knife." With that, the Amazons gathered around the bird, eyeing the shuriken still lodged within before Queen Hippolyta cleared her throat, getting the Amazons to recollect themselves, as she said, "That was a wonderful display. Now, let us be off, as there is still training to be done and books to gather." With that, Queen Hippolyta began riding her horse, leading the group back towards their homes with Ash, who simply followed and did not cause any problems. Unaware that something was already happening due to Ash's escape from the planet he was on. Meanwhile, unknown location. "This is strange. Why have I lost connection with the Tenno?" The mysterious voice questioned, as they had been guiding the Tenno to extraction so that they could meet up with their Cephalon, when the connection suddenly cut out. As if someone or something did not want the Tenno to be extracted by their orbiter and Cephalon. "What do you mean you lost connection? Where are they?" exclaimed a deep voice that sounded like a hardened warrior. The one who said this was a 7-foot-tall giant covered in heavy armor. The armor was navy blue in color with sections colored black with little orange lights scattered throughout the armor. On the shoulder pads was the silver, emboldened image of a demonic head, while the helmet had a sharp horn at the front of the forehead that came to a point. "Calm yourself, brother. I'm sure the Lotus is just as confused and worried as you are," came a mature, feminine voice. The figure sat on a box in the room before calmly getting off the box and walking over to the larger figure. When they stood next to them, it showed the vast difference in size, as where one was a 7-foot-tall giant of armor and mass, the one standing next to them was quite small in comparison. Standing at 5 feet, the figure was quite obviously feminine. They wore a red armor set that was the very opposite compared to the figure's heavy armor set, as they wore hardly any armor except a red shoulder pad on their left shoulder with some gold cylinders protruding. Aside from that, there were red and gold sections covering the feet, front torso, upper thighs, and forearms. Everything else was gray. Finally, they wore a red and gold metal rice hat with a thin shawl going around the edge of the hat except for the front. This revealed their face to be a gray mask around the sides and back with gold accents that came to the front where it was like a gold circle with a dull blue glowing ring separating the majority of the inner circle and a small part of the outer circle. Seeing the other figure, looking at them, the bigger figure nodded before saying, "I apologize, Lotus, sister. I'm simply worried for the Tenno." "I understand," the now revealed Lotus said, "we are all worried for the Tenno. However, we do not have time to stay idle. We must track down the ship the Tenno took when they escaped. I will locate where the Grineer are holding the information before sending you on a mission to retrieve it." "We will be ready, Lotus," the smaller one said as they clutched the gun in their hands while the large one tightened their grip on a massive warhammer. Back on Themyscira. It's been a few months since Ash had crashed on Themyscira and things had been going well. Of course, at first, things were a bit tense since he was a stranger, so Hippolyta had asked if he wouldn't mind staying in their prison for a few weeks, if just to show he wasn't a threat. Ash hadn't been happy about that, not wanting to have just gotten away from nearly being the prisoner of one group, only to wind up the prisoner of another. However, he understood that to all of them, he was a stranger with unknown motives, so he agreed and allowed himself to be imprisoned for those few weeks. Luckily, they were at least civil with him, that was a plus. It also helped that Diana would often stop by and spend time with him, leading the two to talk, often about random things, such as how things worked on Themyscira. She told him how the women of Themyscira were warriors who trained every day, honing their skills so that they could be the strongest. To accomplish this, they often held tournaments, showcasing their skills and allowing others to point out anything they needed to improve on. She also told him how other than training, the women of Themyscira would also gather their own food, enjoy the peace they had, create works of art, and so on. Other than their random talks, Diana would also bring books so that he could learn about the world he'd crashed onto. She brought him books on medicine, politics, cooking, agriculture, and so on, with the two often talking for hours about the various things they found in the books, such as the desserts, which Diana often said she's loved to try. This often led Ash to tease Diana about how, despite being a powerful warrior princess, she still had girly tastes like that, which got her to blush a lot in embarrassment. However, despite reading the books, Ash felt as though something was missing, and he got his answer when Queen Hippolyta would stop by his cell at night and bring him books. Reading the books, he saw that they were books on this world's technology. When he asked why she brought them to him at night, Queen Hippolyta told him that knowledge on technology is forbidden knowledge to the Amazons, but that since he would be leaving someday, it was best that he learn about it. However, she'd given him a warning, to not tell any of the Amazons about what he read, especially her daughter. Knowing how serious she was, Ash gave his word that he wouldn't mention anything about what he read to the Amazons or to Diana. Queen Hippolyta had accepted this, but told him that she would still keep an eye on him, which he understood. Before she'd left that night, he'd asked if she wouldn't be opposed to stopping by so that he could talk with her as well, since as the queen, she might know more about what was in the books on tech than he did. Hippolyta had been surprised at first, not expecting him to ask this, but she had accepted, and since then, would stop by when she could so that they could talk about the knowledge in the books. Though, an interesting issue came up when they all found out that he couldn't eat, and that he didn't even feel hunger, thirst, or even a need to sleep. However, despite this, Ash was thankful that they had tried to give him food, but that since he couldn't eat or drink, that it was fine for them to preserve their food for themselves. Diana and Hippolyta hadn't liked this, as they couldn't think of anyone who could survive without sustenance, but figured that Ash's physiology must have been very different from a human's. After a few weeks of staying in the cell, and talking with Diana and her mother, he was finally given enough trust to be allowed out of his cell. He was even allowed his scythes and shuriken back, though Hippolyta kept his gun since that would have caused the other Amazons to ask questions and that wouldn't have been good. It hadn't even been an hour after he was released and given his weapons that Diana had come to him and asked for a spar. He had agreed and all the Amazons had gathered around, wanting to see their princess defeat the outsider, only for them to all receive a massive shock when Diana was the one on the floor with Ash as the winner. Ever since then, Diana would challenge him once a day, and every time, Ash would defeat her. Today was no different, as right now, Ash and Diana were in the middle of another spar. Hand-to-hand only, as the last time they had used weapons, His sides had sliced clean through the sword she had been using. "Come on, Diana," Ash said as he tilted out of the way from a punch. "If you telegraph your moves this much, even a child would be able to dodge your punch." Diana, who was covered in dirt and scratches from getting tossed around, simply replied, "Well, sorry. But we can't all be perfect warriors like yourself, that's why we train." She then charged him again, throwing punch after punch, unable to land a hit on him as he kept dodging her punches. Eventually, she slipped up and overextended, which Ash took full advantage of and grabbed her arm before flipping her over his shoulder and causing her to hit the floor, knocking the air out of her. As she lay there, staring at the sky, catching her breath, she saw Ash's head pop into her vision as he said, "I think that's enough for today, don't you?" However, she caught him by surprise when she suddenly spun around, knocking him legs from under him before she straddled him as she held his arms above his head. "Now, I think it's enough," Diana said with a smile, having finally won a spar against Ash. At this, Ash began laughing as he nodded his head and said, "Yeah, okay, I get it. Can you get off now?" However, Ash's request went ignored as he suddenly felt Diana placing her hand against where his face would be, rubbing her thumb as if stroking his cheek. Ash gently grabbed her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze as he softly said, "Diana?" She simply stared back at him, squeezing his hand back as she softly said, "Ash." However, wherever their moment was going to go, it died the instant they heard someone clear their throat. At this, Diana quickly jumped off of Ash, blushing brightly while Ash swiftly sat up, cross-legged, while looking to the side as he held his hands in front of himself. Though, they suddenly heard a chuckle and looked to see a woman who looked almost exactly like Hippolyta. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin, red, full lips, and a full figure with D-cup S that was shown by the tight gold and white bodysuit that was open at her shoulders and arms and hugged her long, luscious legs. She also wore a gold necklace, gold shin guards, and white boots. Currently though, she had her arms crossed under her impressive bust as she smirked at the two of them. "Arisia," Diana exclaimed as she brushed off some of the dirt from her clothes, "don't scare us like that. I thought you were mother." Arisia chuckled as she said, "Oh? And why would you be afraid of our mother? Could it be that you don't want her to witness something concerning our friend here?" Hearing this, Diana couldn't but blush more while Ash rubbed the back of his head, neither able to come up with a response which just got Arisia to laugh some more. However, after a moment, she stopped and simply smiled before saying, "Relax, I won't tell mother of your little moment. Just be more aware of your surroundings next time. You never know who might be watching." Diana nodded as she said, "I will keep that in mind." "Thank you, sister." With that, Arisia nodded before looking at Ash and saying, "Now, aside from teasing you both, Queen Hippolyta has called for you. It seems she has something to discuss with you, Ash." At this, he perked up before nodding as he stood as he said, "I understand, I'll head there right now." With that, he jumped into the trees, as he began making his way to the palace, leaving the two sisters behind. Unaware that as soon as he had left, Arisia turned to her sister and said, "You know, I can be quite loose-lipped when I'm tired. Especially after cleaning the library." Diana groaned, knowing that her sister wouldn't have stayed quiet that easily. She could only hope that her sister's demands weren't as bad as that time she'd made Diana clean the stables to the horses by herself. With Ash. As Ash jumped through the trees, he thought about the time he spent on Themyscira and was glad that of all the places he could have crashed, he had crashed here. He thought about his time with Diana, Hippolyta, and the other Amazons and could easily say that these last few months had been the best that he can remember. Though, considering he had no memory other than these last few months, that wasn't saying much. Ash had tried so many times to try and remember his past, but he'd had no such luck. Even Diana and Queen Hippolyta had tried to help him, but they didn't have much luck either. However, despite not having any memory, he couldn't help but feel as though he needed to find something, he just didn't know what. Whatever other thoughts that were roaming around his mind, he didn't give much thought as he landed in front of the steps to the palace. Nodding to the Amazon guards, he walked past them as he went inside the palace where he found Queen Hippolyta sitting on her throne. "You wanted to see me, Your Highness?" Seeing the warrior, Hippolyta smiled as she stood from her throne and said, "Yes, walk with me." With that, she began walking to a door on the side, with Ash quickly catching up so that he was walking just slightly behind her, as a form of respect for her status as Queen of the Amazons. The two walked in silence as they made their way to the gardens, upon which Hippolyta took a seat on one of the marble benches while Ash sat in a seiza position on the floor. "I love spending my time in the gardens," Hippolyta said as she smiled softly, enjoying the peace. Ash nodded, resting his hands on his thighs as he said, "Agreed, it's strange, but I've never felt more at peace than when I'm with nature." At this Hippolyta smiled sadly at the amnesiac warrior, saddened that she, nor the other Amazons could help him with his lack of memory. However, she could not dwell on such thoughts, not with the conversation she had in mind. "How have your studies been going? I do believe you should have read all the books we have by now." Ash nodded as he responded, "Indeed, I don't believe there are any more books regarding the outside world that need to read." Ash then turned his head to Hippolyta and asked, "I can only assume you wished to speak with me to inform me that it is time I depart, yes?" Hippolyta couldn't help but chuckle sadly as she said, "Always the sharp one, but yes, I wanted to inform you that it is time for you to depart. A boat will be ready in an hour along with your firearm, so I do suggest that you maybe get your affairs in order." Ash nodded, having figured this was where the conversation was going to go, before he stood and turned before lightly bowing at the waist as he said, "Then I thank you for taking care of me these last few months. If I hadn't crashed here, I may still be wandering around, lost and confused." Hippolyta smiled as she nodded her head, "And I thank you, not only for respecting our rules, but also for all you've done for Diana and the other Amazons. It's nice for them to know that not all men in the world are cruel and evil and that some could even prove to be called friends." With that said, Ash began walking away as he had to gather what few belongings he now had and to say goodbye to what few friends he'd made while on the island. Though, he was not looking forward to his farewell with Diana, especially since he knew she'd try and convince him to stay. However, he knew what needed to be done, even if it hurt him to do so. After he'd left the palace, he made a stop by Arisha's place, not only to say goodbye, but also to ask if she possibly had any books he could take with him. Arisha had been surprised when he said he was leaving, but she understood and had given him a hug, when he returned, before handing him some cookbooks and medical journals. Seeing the books, he asked why she gave him the cookbooks, as he could understand the medical journals, but he wanted to know what the cookbooks were for. At this, she told him that they were so that he could finally make a proper meal, as the last time he tried to cook, it turned into charcoal. The two had laughed at that, knowing very well that he couldn't cook, mainly due to his inability to try any food he made. After that, she'd also lent him a leather sack so that he could put the books inside before they shared one last hug before he began heading to his next destination. To see a certain Amazonian princess. He had an idea of where she might be, and had begun heading back to the training area they had been at earlier. As he arrived, he honestly wasn't surprised to see her still training, as she probably felt her victory today was only luck or a fluke. However, he felt different as Shinobi were not known for fighting fairly. At that thought, Ash was surprised, as he hadn't known where that thought had come from. Shaking his head, Ash quickly cleared his thoughts as he began walking over to Diana before he called out, "Diana." Hearing her name, Diana turned and saw Ash before smiling as she stopped training and jogged over to him. "Ash. Welcome back. What did Mother wish to talk to you about?" At this, Ash couldn't help but rub the back of his head as he said, "That's actually what I came to talk to you about." At this, Diana frowned, not liking where this was going. "What do you mean?" "Since I've now read all the books regarding the outside world, Queen Hippolyta has determined it's time for me to leave," Ash replied, getting Diana's eyes to widen. "What? But you can't," Diana exclaimed, "there's still so much we can teach you. We can teach you how to wield swords, lassos, bows, and..." Whatever else Diana was going to say, she held it in when she felt Ash place his hands on her shoulder and said, "Diana, we both know that I do not require training in the use of weapons." At this, Diana couldn't help but nod sadly, as that had been one of the first things they had tried, with her wanting to help him learn so that he could defend himself. However, it came as a shock to all of them when they found that he could use each weapon as if he were a master. Sword, spears, sword and shield, bows and arrows, even using a lasso, Ash had proven himself to be more than capable of using every single weapon they had. Seeing her head down, Ash gently lifted her head up by cupping her chin, allowing him to see tears begin gathering in those wonderful, sky-blue eyes as he said, "Hey, don't cry. We both knew this was going to happen eventually." At that, Diana nodded her head before he said, At least we got to spend these last several months getting to know one another." Hearing this, Diana nodded her head, knowing that he was right. Even if they hadn't been able to figure out much about him, they were able to figure out a few things. He liked to relax in nature, sometimes in a tree on a firm branch, while he read books. He liked to play jokes and pranks, as seen by the one time he'd loosened all the Amazons' saddles before they went on patrol, causing them all to flip upside down. "I want you to promise me something," Diana said before she grabbed his hand from her shoulder and held it in hers. Ash nodded as he said, "Anything. Promise you won't forget about us, about me," Diana said, trying to keep her voice as calm as possible. But Ash could hear the slight bit of desperation in her voice, making him realize that this was extremely important to her. With that thought, Ash nodded his head as he said, "I promise, I will never forget about you or the others." With that, Diana nodded her head before she let go of his hand and wiped her tears, and she said, "Well, I think you should get going. No doubt you still have a few things left to do before we see you off." Ash nodded, before he walked away, not seeing the tears that were falling from Diana's eyes as she watched him walk away. Later, at the beach, just as Hippolyta had said, in only an hour, she'd gotten a small boat ready for him. Walking over to it, he found his gun wrapped in a cloth, so as to hide it from view, while he also found a small, leather pouch. Opening it, he was surprised to find it to be full of gold and precious stones and gems. "I don't believe you had a plan to get some money upon reaching man's world." Ash turned to find Queen Hippolyta standing there, having been the one to speak, while Arisia and the other Amazons all gathered around, "so I took it upon myself to give a bit of assistance. I just hope it is enough." Ash shook his head as he tried to hand it back to Hippolyta as he replied, "I cannot accept this. All of you have already done so much for me." Hearing this, Hippolyta smiled as she closed his hand around the bag and said, "Just accept it. Think of it as our final act of kindness before we see you off." At this, Ash sighed as he nodded and closed the pouch before placing it inside the bag he was using to hold the books. With that, he looked back to Hippolyta and the other Amazons around him as he said, "Thank you all so much for all you've done for me. If there ever comes a time that I can repay this kindness, please, don't hesitate to ask and I will help however I can, I promise." At this, all the Amazons present smiled, knowing that a promise to Ash was a very serious thing. They had all seen him promise various things while on the island. A promise for fresh seafood? He went diving the whole day and brought enough for a feast. A promise to help clean the stables? They were left spotless in a single night. None of the Amazons understood why he took promises so seriously. In fact, Ash didn't either, but that no longer mattered, as they all knew that if he promised he would help them, then they knew he would do it. With that, Ash grabbed the back of the boat and pushed it off the beach and into the water before quickly hopping into the boat. He then unfurled the sail and sat down as he grabbed the rudder, quickly picking up the wind and sailing away from the island. Feeling eyes on him, Ash turned back and he saw a figure standing on the cliff and knew that it was Diana, watching as he left. Waving at her, he saw as she waved back, neither looking away from each other, even as she grew smaller in size from the increasing distance. After Diana and the island were no longer in view, Ash pulled up the hood over his head as he turned back around to focus on where he was going. A few days later, the environment had changed, where everything had been bright with a wide open sky and nice, blue water. Everything suddenly turned dark, with the water turning black like an abyss while the sky filled with dark clouds as if it were going to rain at any moment. Not only that, but Ash could finally see land, where he saw a giant city filled with massive buildings and skyscrapers. He even saw bridges connecting the city to land across the water, which he saw he was no longer in open waters and had somehow entered a type of channel or river. As he came up to a dock, he saw a sign that said, "Gotham Docks," as he grabbed his bag and unwrapped his gun before placing it on his back, as he then tossed the bag over his shoulder and said to himself, "Gotham. Huh, seems like an interesting place." With that, Ash walked down the docks before melding with the shadows and disappearing, unaware what changes his presence would have in this city of near eternal night. These cars are rather noisy, Ash thought to himself as he looked down at the busy streets of Gotham from on top of a building. It's been a few days since Ash arrived in the city of Gotham, and something he noticed was that when night came around, it was extremely dark, almost pitch black, if not for the lights that were all over the city. Over the last few days, Ash had been getting used to the difference in culture and technology in Gotham compared to Themyscira. He knew it would be very different long before he'd arrived. However, it was shocking to see just how different things were. Had he expected fields and fields of grass, trees, and nature with the occasional clump of buildings? No, he hadn't been naive enough to believe that the world outside of Themyscira would be anything like that, especially from what he'd read and seen in the books on Themyscira. However, it was still very shocking to see everything, as it was so different to see things himself compared to reading about them. Even now, seeing all the cars, helicopters, and even the occasional plane was surprising to Ash, but at the same time, he couldn't help but find them annoying with all the noise they made. Not to mention, since he'd read up on science, including pollution, Ash knew about all the gases and such that were being produced and couldn't help but find himself disliking the vehicles. Crash. RRRIINNNGGG. Ash was suddenly brought out from his thoughts when he heard a loud crash, followed by an alarm ringing throughout the streets. Looking down, Ash could see several men wearing black clothing and matching ski masks to cover their faces. Not only that, but he also noticed that they also had weapons, guns to be exact, and they looked to have broken into a jewelry store and were stealing all the precious stones. Usually, due to his lack of understanding of their value, Ash would have ignored the criminals and watched to see response times and actions from the local authorities. Instead, however, he saw the criminals threatening innocent civilians and the scared looks on the people's faces. Ash wasn't sure when he had moved. All he knew was that one moment, he'd been on the roof of a building, and then the next, he was standing behind one of the criminals, scythes in hand, with both hands raised to strike. "Look out!" One of the criminals who'd managed to see Ash standing behind their comrade shouted. However, as the man turned to face Ash, he wasn't quick enough to do much else before Ash brought his arms down, cutting both the gun and the criminal's arms in half. The rest of the criminals were shocked at the brutal attack from this unknown individual but were snapped from their thoughts when the now armless man began screaming before he fell on his ass, blood spraying from the stumps of his arms. Ash charged forward with the man still screaming while his friends began firing their assault rifles. However, they quickly learned how futile that was when they saw the unknown individual blocking the bullets with inhuman speed. "Screw this," one of the bad guys shouted as he threw his gun on the ground and tried to make a run for it, followed by a couple of his friends. Unfortunately, they didn't get very far when they felt pain explode from their legs as they all fell to the floor. Looking at their legs, they saw several shurikens piercing their flesh from their calves to their thighs, bleeding heavily from the wounds as the blood began pooling around their legs. Ash began walking towards the last guy, who looked like he was about to shit his pants, as he pulled up his weapon, a pump-action shotgun, and started shouting, "Stay back, freak." Ash ignored this and kept walking forward, blood-covered scythes in hand and ready to lash out in an instant, while the guy continued shouting, "I'm warning you." He then grabbed a blonde girl from the side, who screamed as the guy put the end of the barrel against the side of her head. "I'll blow her brains out. You hear me?" Seeing that the criminal now had a hostage, Ash stopped advancing, not wanting to put the girl at risk. However, to Ash, suddenly, instead of the criminal and girl he knew he was facing, he saw two different figures take their place. The criminal was suddenly replaced by a man wearing a black cloak with red clouds. An orange mask on his face with a single hole on the right side that allowed Ash to see a single red eye with a black symbol, as well as short, spiky, black hair, while the gun was suddenly replaced by a small, triangle-shaped dagger. Meanwhile, the girl was replaced with another blonde female. But instead of long, straight hair, this girl had sandy blonde, slightly spiky hair in 4 consecutive pigtails. She had teal eyes and was wearing a black kimono with a slit on one side, exposing her leg with a red sash tied around her waist. She was also wearing black fingerless gloves, black sandals, and some kind of forehead protector with a strange symbol. Ash wasn't sure what was happening, but seeing this caused him to take a small step back before lightly shaking his head. The criminal, thinking he'd gotten the upper hand and that this freak was now afraid of him, smirked as he then said, "That's right, now, toss your weapons away." Ash did as he was told even though he didn't like it and tossed his scythes, gun, and shuriken pouch to the side while he clenched his hands tightly. As he did so, both he and the criminal suddenly heard cars pulling up before hearing a loud voice, "This is the GCPD. Release the hostages and come out with your hands up." At this, the criminal sneered as he looked out the window towards where the police were, with the flashing blue and red lights lighting up the jewelry store. However, he just made a mistake by looking away from Ash, an error that Ash took full advantage of by swiftly pulling out a hidden shuriken he had kept under his gun before quickly throwing it at the shotgun. The shuriken then launched itself into the gun right where the firing pin was, preventing the criminal from pulling the trigger. The shock also caused him to let go of the girl he was holding. Seeing the man no longer holding the girl, Ash looked to her and said, "Get the others and get out of here. I'll finish up with things here." Not trusting herself to speak, the girl simply nodded as she quickly ran over to the other hostages and began freeing them while Ash started stalking towards the last criminal, clenching his fists. Meanwhile, while Ash was handling the criminals inside, another car pulled up to the jewelry store. Exiting the vehicle was an older man with gray hair and a matching mustache. He was wearing a pair of black square-rimmed glasses, a beige trench coat, khaki pants with a brown belt, brown dress shoes, and a white, button-up shirt with a black tie. This was Police Commissioner James "Jim" Gordon, and he'd just arrived on the scene of what he had thought was a simple hostage situation. "Johnson," Commissioner Gordon exclaimed, getting one of the men to run over as he continued, "Tell me what's going on." However, before Johnson could begin relaying what happened, they suddenly heard a scream, getting all the cops to keep their guns trained on the doors and windows. A few moments later, all the hostages came running out of the door until they were all outside, several cops stopping them and moving them over to the ambulances that showed up at some point off to the side. Some other cops who had kept their weapons pointed towards the jewelry store didn't move despite all this happening. Until they realized that they couldn't hear a single noise coming from the building, not even a groan. Upon noticing this, they all began to slowly lower their weapons, looking at each other in confusion before holstering their guns. A moment later, Commissioner Gordon snapped out of his thoughts before shouting at his subordinates, "Well, what are you all waiting for? Let's get in there." At the commissioner's shout, all the cops snapped to attention before they quickly rearmed themselves and moved to the door. Then, suddenly, they kicked the door down while rushing inside, guns raised as they shouted, "Police! Freeze!" However, once inside, all the cops were shocked at what they found that they stopped moving, completely blocking the door. Seeing this, Commissioner Gordon walked up and began shoving everyone out of the way as he grunted out, "Get out of the way." Eventually, he made it past all of the people blocking the door, but it was then that he realized why they had stopped moving, not because they couldn't, but because they were shocked at what was inside. As lying on the floor, they found several criminals unconscious, very obviously from blood loss as seen by all the blood pooling around their legs. They found another one dead also from blood loss, evident by the sliced-off arms still dripping blood. However, it was the last guy that drew everyone's attention. The last guy was not only still alive but still conscious too and was whimpering in pain. The reason? His limbs were twisted entirely into unnatural positions while also turning purple as well. Seeing this, Gordon realized that whoever had done this had not only broken the bones but had also dislocated all the joints in order to twist them around. "Don't just stand there," Gordon shouted, snapping out of his thoughts as he holstered his gun, getting all the other cops to snap out of it as well. "Get these punks in cuffs and get them medical attention." At this, all the cops quickly got to work as they all began clearing out while those who had some medical knowledge began securing the bleeding criminals while both the medical team and the forensics team entered and began doing their jobs. The forensics team was allowed to take pictures of the wounds on the unconscious criminals, and even the one turned into a human pretzel before the medical team took them away. At the same time, forensics moved on to gather and tag evidence. An hour later, the medical team had already taken most of the criminals away while forensics continued their job. However, as one of the criminals was being taken away, one of the shurikens came loose and fell out of the wound, causing it to bleed more, which got the attention of the paramedics taking the man to the ambulance. Not noticing the shuriken had dropped near the feet of Commissioner Gordon, who had moved outside to have a smoke when this happened. However, despite the shortfall, he was surprised to see the shuriken had managed to embed itself into the concrete. "That's not natural," Gordon thought to himself, dropping his cigarette on the ground and stomping it out before bending down and carefully picking up the shuriken. Taking a closer look at it, he noticed it didn't look like anything he'd ever seen before. "I'd better get this to Batman. Maybe he can find something that we can't." With that thought, Gordon walked to his car before carefully wrapping it in a spare rag he had in the glove compartment. After putting it away, he rejoined the other cops as he began to tell them what they needed to do, along with recording any information he'd need for his meeting later that night. Several hours later, after spending another hour at the crime scene, the forensics team had finally finished, and with that, the police left to head back to the station. Once there, they questioned the witnesses and even the perps on what had happened. While the citizens had been more than happy to talk, the criminals were not, though that quickly changed after the police had threatened to stop the morphine drip. Gordon groaned as he rubbed his brow and said, "Let me get this straight. You and your buddies all got attacked by a dark figure wielding scythes and ninja stars after you broke into a jewelry store while waving your guns around at innocent civilians?" Currently, Gordon was interrogating the last of the criminals in Gotham Hospital to try and get all the facts he could. However, it was proving to be more and more annoying no matter who he asked. He got the same story of a strange, black figure wielding what sounded like ninja weapons. The criminal nodded fearfully, completely unable to relax as they kept jumping at any loud noise and even seemed to be trying to move away from the shadows in the room. "That's right. I thought it was going to be an easy job. Just scare some people, grab the jewels, and leave. I didn't sign on to become some freaky ninja's target practice." Gordon was about to continue questioning the man, but unfortunately, it was at that moment that the criminal had begun seizing before the doctors rushed in and began shouting, "He's going into cardiac arrest. Quickly, get a crash cart and start compressions." Seeing that he wasn't likely to get any more information, Gordon gathered his things before getting up and leaving the room. After he left the hospital, he got in his car and drove back to the GCPD headquarters, where he quickly gathered a copy of all the evidence he and the other cops had gathered, including a copy of the security footage from the jewelry store before heading to the roof. Once there, he walked over to a large spotlight and turned it on, causing a large bat symbol to appear in the sky while Gordon placed down all the files and lit a cigarette. A few minutes passed, and Gordon had finished smoking his cigarette when he heard a deep voice call out, "Jim." Blowing out the last breath of smoke and stomping out the still smoking cigarette butt, Jim turned around and looked up to see the Dark Knight of Gotham himself. The man wore a full-body suit of dark gray, triple-weave Kevlar with a black bat symbol in the center of his chest. He also wore a black cowl connected to a cape with a dark gray lining and was black on the outside that covered his whole body and fell to the floor. His cowl had two pointed tips on the sides, almost like bat ears, hiding his upper face and eyes while leaving his mouth and the area around it exposed. He had a set of black gloves that extended up to his forearms that were armored with small fins going down the sides of them, which he sometimes used to attack but mainly used to catch and break swords or knives. He also wore a set of black tights, black boots, and finally, a yellow utility belt around his waist. "Batman," Gordon said as he grabbed the files before saying, "Got something you should probably take a look at." Jumping down, Batman walks over and takes the files Gordon held out to him as he opens the folder. Going through it, Batman looked at the photos of the criminals and their injuries, taking note of the brutality of the injuries. Then, walking closer to the edge, Batman quietly spoke, "Are you seeing this?" Now, one might think he was talking to the only other person there. However, they would be wrong as Batman suddenly heard a female voice in his ear, "Yeah, I can. But, geez, what happened to these guys?" The voice in his ear belonged to one Barbara Gordon, Jim Gordon's daughter, who fights alongside Batman as his protégé, Batgirl. Currently, she was on a rooftop a few buildings away, looking at a small tablet that she and Batman usually carry in the front part of their utility belts for various uses. The reason she was far away was that neither she nor Batman wanted to run the risk of Gordon recognizing her, so she stayed away while Batman would broadcast what he saw so that she could see too. "I don't know yet, but I'll find out," Batman said to Barbara before speaking normally again as he asked Gordon, "Can you tell me what happened?" Gordon nodded as he lit another cigarette and said, "Those were the criminals involved in a robbery-turned-hostage situation at a jewelry store." "Were?" Batman asked as he looked at Jim. Gordon sighed as he rubbed his head before continuing, "When I arrived on the scene, I was ready to begin giving orders so that we could save the hostages as quickly and safely as possible. However, moments after I'd arrived on the scene, a scream rang out through the area, coming from the store with all the hostages running out not a minute later. After we went inside, we found almost all the criminals unconscious, bleeding from their legs, one of them dead from having both of his arms cut off, and the last one had his limbs twisted and mangled. Hearing all of this, Batman and Batgirl were both shocked at the revelation as Batman had been going through the pictures while Gordon was talking. Having seen all the injuries Gordon mentioned, including the fact that the criminal who'd had their arms cut off seemed to have been a perfect cut. No tearing from getting caught on muscle tissue or the bone. As if cutting through a human arm was no different to cutting through butter with a hot knife. Do you have any idea what happened? Batman asked, wanting to get started soon so that he could get to the bottom of this. Gordon, at the question, answered, yeah, and if it weren't for us collecting the security footage from the store, I'd have thought you changed costumes and started handing out more brutal beatings than normal. He attempted at a joke. He then took out his phone and opened a video before extending it towards Batman as he said, take a look. Taking the phone, Batman and Batgirl both saw the criminals enter the store, civilians lying on the ground to prevent themselves from being killed. Before, they were surprised at the sudden appearance of a figure covered in what looked like a strange bio-organic-based black armor with a hood. They watched as he slashed the only dead criminal's arms before easily defending himself from the rest of the bullets being fired at him, scaring off the other criminals and causing them to run before their legs were riddled with shuriken. Finally, they watched as he took a step back before surrendering his weapons when the last criminal grabbed a hostage. They saw the criminal talking before looking out the window, a poor mistake that both Batman and Batgirl recognized, as they saw the unknown figure throw a shuriken with pinpoint accuracy to disable the gun, causing the last perp to release the girl. From there, they watched a brutal showcase of the unknown figure gripping the criminal's limbs with enough strength to crush said limbs and watching as he skillfully dislocated and manipulated the criminal's limbs to put them in painful positions. They even saw that the unknown figure seemed to know how to perfectly put the joints back in place despite not being in their normal positions, locking them into position. All of this was done while they occasionally seemed to push certain spots on the criminal's body when the man was about to pass out, no doubt, from the unbearable pain. According to the doctors at the hospital, Gordon spoke as he let out a breath of smoke. The last criminal was kept forcefully awake through a series of pressure points so that he got to experience all the pain of having his limbs broken, dislocated, and twisted without rest. Only someone trained to know the human body could do all of this to a person without killing them. The way they fight, the weapons they use, and the brutal form of torture. All of this points to the League of Shadows, but why are they here now? Batman said, both to Gordon and Batgirl. Gordon shook his head as he said, I don't think it's the League this time, getting Batman to look at him as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a rag before tossing it to Batman, who caught it with ease. I took that after it fell out of one of the perp's legs. Batman, upon hearing this, opened the rag, allowing him to see the still bloody shuriken as Gordon then said, now, we've both seen our fair share of League weapons, and I can tell you this, that doesn't look anything like any weapon the League have used before, or anyone on Earth for that matter. Batman nodded, seeing Gordon's point as he said, so, if it's not the League, then it just means that there's someone new and dangerous roaming around Gotham. At this, Gordon nodded and said, yeah, however, I don't think whoever this is will be a danger to the civilians. The security footage showed that much when he surrendered his weapons to prevent an innocent from being hurt or killed. Batman shook his head and said, it doesn't matter if they are dangerous to civilians or not. The fact of the matter is that they're an unknown individual with unknown intentions, and I need to find and stop them. Gordon sighed as he turned to the door to head back inside but stopped as he grabbed the handle and said, I know I can't stop you, but if anything, be careful. As we don't want to make someone an enemy simply because we were. Before he finished, he turned back around, wanting to finish what he was saying, only to see Batman was nowhere to be found, getting Gordon to sigh as he shook his head and said, why'd I never learn? Before he walked inside, planning to head back to his desk and coordinate with the other precincts. With Batman, after leaving the roof of the GCPD, Batman had quickly reunited with Batgirl, with the two heading to the Batcave to discuss a plan concerning this new individual. So, what do you think? Batgirl asked as the two were going over the evidence they were given by her dad. Think he's a good guy? Maybe a new hero? Batgirl wore a costume similar to Batman's in terms of design and even had a cowl to cover her face while the lower half of her face was left visible, showing her full, kissable lips, but with some differences. Instead of the dark gray and black colors like Batman, hers was black where Batman's was gray and yellow where his was black. Her costume, like Batman's, was also skin-tight, giving her the best mobility when fighting but also allowed her body to be shown off, letting everyone see her thick thighs, toned ass, fit stomach, and her still growing high B to mid C cup S. Finally, some more differences were that, unlike Batman's cape, hers went down to just above her toned ass while her cowl was open in the back, allowing her red hair to flow freely and show that it goes down to just past her shoulders. However, right now, she had her cowl down, allowing her green eyes to be seen while she leaned against a workbench in the Batcave. I don't know, but the fact of the matter is that not only does he possess the skills to take out 5 armed individuals easily, but he also has the senses, reaction speed, and physical speed to defend himself against several automatic rifles being fired at him, Batman said, with his cowl also down, showing his black hair and eyes, revealing Batman to be none other than billionaire playboy, Bruce Wayne. Currently, the two had the security footage playing in slow motion so that they could carefully watch the unknown individual not just blocking but sometimes slicing the bullets flying at him with 100% accuracy and not a single wasted movement. So they can defend themselves from bullets and guns. What's the problem with that? Barbara asked as she moved to lean on the chair in front of the Batcave's supercomputer that Bruce was using. It's the fact that they have no issue killing or attacking people with lethal force, Bruce said as he looked over at a separate screen that kept replaying the unknown figure slicing clean through both the gun and the criminal's arms with no issue. We can't have someone like this running around without knowing what their intentions are, Bruce said while getting up and walking over to another workbench that was currently analyzing the bloody shuriken he'd been given, especially when they possess weapons capable of slicing through not only a gun but the arms of the person holding it all without any form of resistance. At this, Barbara couldn't help but nod and say, "Okay, I'll admit, not knowing what they plan to do and having weapons that strong is indeed a problem, but we shouldn't jump to conclusions without talking to them. And I do mean talking, you know, like normal people and not your form of talking. That involves sending them to a hospital." At this, Bruce was silent for a moment before nodding as he said, "Fine, however, if it turns out they aren't willing to talk, we're going back to my method." At this, Barbara nodded as she sighed and thought, "At least he was willing to listen to me this time." She then looked at one of the still images Bruce had selected from the footage, and it was when the unknown figure had taken the small step back. She thought, besides, I doubt they're that bad, especially if they did everything to save all those people. With Ash after leaving the jewelry store. After he saved the civilians, Ash quickly left the store by teleporting back to the top of the building he'd been watching from before running. He ran and ran, jumping across the roofs of buildings before he stopped after a few minutes, finding himself to be quite a distance away from the jewelry store. Seeing how far he was, he leaned back against the glass of the building he was on before sliding down so that he was now sitting on the ground. As Ash sat down and leaned his head against the glass, he thought about what happened in the store. Why did I react like that? I don't understand. Who was that woman I saw, and why was I filled with this sense of anger? Suddenly, Ash jumped as he looked and saw a helicopter flying by with a spotlight causing him to turn invisible and think, it's a good thing I don't need to activate my abilities the normal way, but I can't keep this up forever. I need a place to hide and lay low. As the helicopter passed by, Ash watched the spotlight light up a sign that was next to him and saw it said, Gotham's Botanical Gardens. Botanical Gardens? Ash thought to himself as he looked and noticed that the entire roof was essentially just a greenhouse and that the plants grew enough to completely cover the glass aside from some small patches to allow sun inside and people to see outside. This looks good enough. With that thought, while still invisible, Ash moved around the outside of the greenhouse until he found a door, also made of glass, and entered the gardens, closing the door behind him. As he walked further inside, he missed some vines growing to block the door while looking around at the other plants. Coming out of his invisibility, Ash pulled down his hood as he walked around before finding a clean table where he placed his weapons down. Suddenly, Ash sensed something and quickly tried to grab his scythes again, only for him to be unable to do anything as several vines reacted and grabbed him before they pulled him into the air, wrapping around him like a cocoon. As he hung in the air, upside down, Ash began struggling, trying to free himself before he suddenly heard a woman chuckling. Looking around, trying to find where the laughing was coming from, before he saw some plants moving, creating an opening for him to see the woman who was laughing. Green was the first thing he noticed when he saw her. He saw that the entirety of her body was a mint green color from her toes, since she was barefoot, to the tips of her fingers, with her fingernails painted red. She was wearing a dark green, sleeveless leotard that hugged her body and showed off her tight stomach and E-cup ass while showing some cleavage. She also wore a set of stockings that looped around the arch of her feet, leaving the rest visible while at the same time showing off her luscious thighs, which drew attention to her heart-shaped butt. She also wore sleeves on her arms that went from her wrist to just below her shoulders with vines lacing the edges of everything she wore and even lightly wrapped around her thighs, calves, shoulders, collarbone, and forearms. Finally, she had emerald green eyes with light green sclera, dark green eyebrows, and full, kissable, emerald green lips. However, the part of her that drew his attention the most was her fiery, red hair that went down past her ass. He watched as she walked closer to him, hips swaying with her right hand on her hip before stopping right in front of him. He knew the situation he was currently in. He was this woman's captive, her prisoner, and he needed to find a way to free himself, grab his weapons, and escape. But, unfortunately, he found himself unable to do anything except say, "Beautiful." Ash thought he'd whispered it to himself, but unfortunately for him, he hadn't, allowing this unknown woman to hear precisely what he said as she developed a surprised look on her face. "Well, thank you," she said with a smile, snapping Ash out of his thoughts. "I've never really had anyone call me beautiful without me first taking control of them with my pheromones. So now, what are you doing in my home?" she asked as she crossed her arms under her ample bust. At this, Ash said, "I'm sorry, I wasn't aware someone was living here. I'd only wanted a place to lay low for a while where I wouldn't be discovered easily." The woman blinked at his response before she asked, "Do you not know who I am?" Ash shook his head and responded, "No, am I supposed to know who you are?" "I'm Poison Ivy," the now named Poison Ivy exclaimed as she raised her hands in the air. "Nice to meet you. I'm Ash," Ash greeted calmly. "Now, could you maybe let me down?" At this, Ivy was shocked as she asked, "Do you really not know me?" "The Poison Ivy? You know? Known eco-terrorist, villainous, and one of Batman's rogues?" She looked at him, only seeing him tilt his head to one side as she dropped her arms and said, "Nothing?" Ash shook his head and said, "Sorry, I'm new to, well, everything here on Earth. Though, villainous, and eco-terrorist? What did you do for people to label you with those titles?" At this, Ivy crossed her arms again as she looked away and said, "I've been destroying companies and businesses that endanger the planet through pollution or just pure destruction, like cutting down forests, destroying fields, and so on. Honestly, the nerve of these greedy, stupid." "I think I understand," Ash said, cutting Ivy off before she started ranting, "but do you think we could continue this after you've put me down? I'd prefer to be standing upright as I have a conversation rather than being held upside down." At this, Ivy finally remembered that her babies had been holding him in the air the whole time and was about to have them let him down until she narrowed her eyes, leaned closer to him, bending at the waist, and asking, "How do I know I can trust you and that you're not just a vigilante trying to send me back to prison?" "Well," Ash began as he lightly shrugged as best as he could, while still being tightly bound and held upside down, "For one, I didn't even know who you were, so I wouldn't have known whether I should arrest you or not. Second, if I had wanted to," Ash said before teleporting behind her, getting her to spin around in shock, only to see him now sitting on a branch as he said, "I could have gotten out whenever I wanted." Seeing this, Ivy thought he was going to attack her but relaxed slightly when she saw he wasn't moving from his spot and even turned around to see his weapons still on the table. Turning back, she decided to give him the benefit of the doubt and summoned some vines to carry her up to where he was before they formed a small bed as she lay down on her stomach. "So," Ash started as he leaned on his knees while resting his head on the knuckles of his right hand, "you mentioned destroying companies and businesses that are harming the environment. Why not try and talk with them and convince them to change their ways?" At this, Ivy scoffed as she turned her head and rested it on the palm of her hand while saying, "You think I haven't tried? Because I have on so many occasions while even offering alternatives when possible, but every single one of them only cared about the money they could make. Why not try reporting them? Same reason," Ivy exclaimed as she flipped onto her back. "No matter what, all of them only care about money. The companies and businesses, we can't afford to change how we do things just to save a few trees. The police, well, they aren't doing anything illegal. Every single one of them only cared for the money that lined their pockets." Ash hummed in thought before saying, why not simply prove you're better and beat them at their own game? At this, Poison Ivy quickly sat up with her legs crossed and turned to look at him with a glare and shouted, "So I should damage and destroy the environment as much as them?" Hearing this and realizing how what he said sounded, Ash quickly shook his head while raising his hands and saying, "No. I did not mean for it to sound like that. What I meant was, why not start your own company or work with one that actually wants to help the environment and make them better than the companies you don't like?" At this, Ivy was about to shout again but stopped short as she thought on his suggestion and realized he had a point. If she could make her own company or elevate a competitor of the companies she hates, wouldn't that get more people to help her cause? However, she then shook her head as she rested her hands on her legs, slightly squeezing her ample bust, and said, "Even if I wanted to, I'm a notorious villain and well-known eco-terrorist. So nobody's going to want to work with me, even if we all want to save nature." "Well, I will," Ash said while pointing to himself, getting Ivy to look in shock. What do you mean, I will?" Ivy exclaimed as she moved the bed of vines closer to Ash before grabbing his shoulders and shaking him while shouting, "Don't you understand what working with me means? You could potentially be labeled as a villain for simply helping me. Heroes like Batman would target you. The Flash, fucking Superman, for God's sake. Not to mention, once again, I'm a criminal. So, why would you want to help me?" After her rant, Ivy was panting heavily as she tried to catch her breath while she watched as Ash calmly pulled her hands off his shoulders before gently holding them in his own hands as he said, "Because I believe you're a good person who wants to do good but was a little late on realizing how. And if you don't believe you're a good person, what about right now? Instead of just accepting my help and later tricking me into helping with some plan to destroy a company, you were worried about me and what it might look like if I were helping you." At this, Ivy realized he was right, and if she were as bad as she believed herself to be, she would have simply used Ash to continue destroying the companies she hated. But no, she was worried for him, worried that he'd be made to look like a villain and would ruin his life forever. Ivy slowly pulled her hands out of Ash's as she said, "Well, even if I wanted to start my own company, I don't have any money. Not to mention that people would be suspicious of me suddenly starting my own company and would scrutinize every move I make." Ash crossed his arms behind his head and leaned back against the trunk of the tree he was sitting in before asking, "What if you were able to change or fix your reputation?" At this, Ivy was silent for a moment before she shook her head and replied, "No, that'll never happen. At this point, I can't fix my reputation as a villain. Nobody would ever take me seriously, so why even try?" At this, Ash realized that Ivy wouldn't continue this conversation, so he asked, "Well, considering I'm not here to arrest or fight you, would it be alright if I stay here for a while? I can pull my weight if you need me to." Ivy couldn't help but sigh as she nodded and said, "Yes, you can stay here for a while. But if you're staying here, then I want you to help take care of my babies." "Okay," Ash said as he nodded with Ivy moving away but not before he finished saying, "And for the record, I would believe in you if you wanted to make a change." At this, Ivy swiftly turned back to look at Ash, eyes wide with shock and surprise, only to see him looking up at the moon through the skylight. Unable to help herself, Ivy slightly smiled as she turned back around and went back to taking care of the plants. A few days later, it had been a few days since Ash had been given Poison Ivy's permission to stay in the botanical gardens with her, and he could honestly say that things were going well. At first, there were a few rough points due to his lack of knowledge of taking care of the plants. Books are one thing, actual experience is another, but she was quick to correct his mistakes and even teach him what he did wrong. At the same time, Ash had tried to talk to her about finding alternative ways to stop the companies and organizations she doesn't like without causing mass destruction or potential deaths. Though Ivy was still on the fence, she at least promised him that she wouldn't attack anybody for a while since she wanted a small break from everything regarding heroes and villains, so that was something at least. Right now, Ash was going through Gotham, keeping an eye out for other events like before as he traveled from the rooftops, easily making the distance between buildings with his speed, bullet jumps, and some very extreme parkour. Though, with the buildings that were just slightly too far, he would use his teleport ability to make up the rest of the distance. Even now, if one were to look up, they might get lucky and notice a black blur for a split second as it passed between buildings. Ash was running at full speed as he sprinted towards the edge of the roof on top of the building that he was currently on before pushing himself off the edge to launch himself into a bullet jump. landing on the far edge of the next building before stopping himself and crouching down to look over Gotham's busy nighttime streets. Ash then changed his view to look over the city in its entirety, and he couldn't help but think he had forgotten something. Something important to him. However, before he could think about it for too long, he was broken from his thoughts when he heard an alarm ring out from a small distance away. Deciding to investigate, Ash launched himself off the roof's edge, jumping forward and making his way towards the ringing alarm. As he drew closer, he found that the alarm was coming from a museum, as Ivy had told him when they'd gone around Gotham the night after they'd met so that she could show him the sights and tell him about places he didn't know. Landing on a building just across the street from the museum, he was able to see a figure run out of a door on the rooftop, and while he couldn't get a clear view of them, he could see the bag around their shoulders swinging around in the air from their movement. Figuring them to be the thief, Ash quickly made his way to cut them off and get the bag and whatever they stole back so he could return it to the museum. Meanwhile, while Ash moved to catch up with the thief, we find said person quickly running along the rooftops of Gotham with a smile on their face. They wore a skin-tight, black leather jumpsuit with a zipper in the front that hugged their body, showing they were a woman with wide hips, toned, heart-shaped ass, thick thighs, and DD-cup S. Their jumpsuit also had a hood with what looked like two cat ears on top, covering their entire head except for their face. They also had a set of gray goggles with green lenses and a black whip that wrapped around their waist several times and a set of claws at the ends of their fingertips. This was Catwoman, a well-known thief in Gotham, and not precisely a supervillain, but more like an extreme troublemaker with all her teasing of Batman being very well known. Right now, she'd just stolen a solid jade cat statue from the Gotham Museum's wing of ancient Chinese artifacts before making her escape from the museum and had been running for a few minutes before finally stopping. Catching her breath, she sat down on an air conditioning unit near the edge of the rooftop she had decided to stop on, a large brown bag next to her, slowly breathing in and out as she had not only been running but had also been performing flips, twists, and other acrobatic moves while also using her whip to swing herself around as well. As she rested, she decided to look at her prize and reached for the bag that held the jade statue she'd stolen, only to find the bag was not where she put it. Quickly turning, she saw the bag was nowhere in sight and beginning to get frustrated. "Where is it?" she growled out as she roughly took off her goggles, showing a bit of her black hair peeking out the front of her hood and green eyes that went well with her tanned skin and full lips. "I know I didn't drop it. The strap couldn't have broken since that bag is brand new. So where is it?" "You know," a voice called out, getting Catwoman to swiftly turn on her feet as she looked up to see someone calmly sitting on the billboard that was on the other side of the rooftop she had chosen to catch her breath on. "I've never understood why people feel the need to steal things. It just seems stupid to me." Seeing the figure, Catwoman was wondering where they had come from until she saw a very familiar bag in their hands before they reached inside and shouted, "Hey! That's mine." "I believe the museum's alarms would suggest otherwise," he, as the voice and build were both rather masculine, said before he pulled out the jade statue she had stolen and looked it over before putting it back inside the bag. "Don't worry though, I don't plan on keeping it. I'll simply return this and let the museum worry about increasing security." She watched as he stood up and turned towards the direction of the museum, quickly guessing that he was about to leave, which she couldn't allow. Especially not after all the work she went through to get that statue. With that thought in mind, Catwoman pulled her whip from her waist as she lashed it out and caught the figure's foot, catching him by surprise before she yanked him down, slamming him into one of the other air conditioning units that were on the roof, damaging it rather severely. Walking over, thinking the fall and subsequent impact had knocked him unconscious, she reached for the bag that was still in his hand until he grabbed her arm and threw her through the air. Fortunately, thanks to her flexibility and acrobatic skills, she was able to catch herself after several flips before watching the figure get off the unit and easily stand up and brush himself off. Seeing him stand up, as if she hadn't just slammed him into a giant air conditioning unit, slightly unnerved Catwoman as she asked, "Who, or better yet, what are you?" Ash thought about her question for a moment before remembering what the mysterious voice from several months ago had called him before answering, "My name is Ash, and I'm a Tenno." At the word, Catwoman found herself asking, "What's a Tenno?" Hearing the question, Ash began thinking about it and was about to answer when suddenly, shatter, crash, tinkle. The two of them heard glass shattering, followed by a loud crash, and then glass falling on the ground. Not knowing what it was, Ash put the bag over his shoulder, letting it hang there as he quickly jumped towards the crash, wanting to make sure no one got hurt. Seeing he was leaving, Catwoman quickly gave chase while shouting, "Give me back my bag and statue." She gave chase as best she could, but unfortunately, she couldn't keep up with Ash as he got further and further away. Eventually, she watched him drop down between two buildings and sped up, trying to catch him so that she could get her bag back. However, as she landed on the edge of the building where he had dropped down, the thought of getting her bag and the statue inside of it back disappeared from her mind when she saw the scene they had come across. Several smashed and broken crates. Garbage spilling out from knocked-over trash cans. As well as a small pool of blood in the center of the damaged crates and garbage. Finally, with this particular sight nearly setting her off due to her already being frustrated from before, was Ash standing among the broken crates, holding an unconscious woman who was the source of the blood, as she was not only bleeding from the corner of her mouth but also had blood dripping from a wound on her side that was caused by the piece of wood that was currently sticking out of it. The woman had an unnaturally pale face with dark red, almost black lipstick, a black domino mask on her face with a skin-tight, full-body jester costume that had alternating black and red colors on it with matching color flats. Because of the outfit being skin-tight, it also showed off the woman's luscious thighs, toned ass, fit, tight stomach, and high C-cup borderline D-cup S. Her costume also had fluffy white cuffs on her wrists and a white collar. This was Harley Quinn, villainous and supposed partner to none other than the Joker himself, otherwise known as the Clown Prince of Crime, as well as Batman's arch-nemesis. Not only that, but she was also a dear friend to both Catwoman and Poison Ivy. Seeing Harley in this stranger's arms, bleeding, unconscious, and possibly dying, Catwoman used her whip to launch herself at Ash as she shouted, "Put her down." Unfortunately, just as she was going to kick him, he disappeared while she landed on the ground before looking up to see him on the edge of a rooftop for a split second before disappearing, taking her friend with him. "Get back here," Catwoman shouted as she used her whip and acrobatic skills to flip and swing herself onto the roof, where she saw Ash was quite a distance away and was slowly getting further away. Not wanting to lose him for fear that he would do something to her friend, Catwoman immediately began chasing after him, going faster than she'd ever gone before. Unfortunately, neither she nor Ash noticed a shadowy figure watching them that looked very similar to Batman except for the flowing, red hair until they disappeared. Catwoman ran, flipped, and swung with all her might, trying to close the distance between herself and Harley's abductor. She ignored the burning in her lungs. She ignored the strain she felt in her legs. She even pulled down her hood, not even caring if Batman saw her and figured out who she was because of the sweat building and falling down her hair and forehead. She wouldn't lose her friend. Not like this. She was happy when she began gaining ground on Ash and Harley before finally noticing that he was heading towards the botanical gardens. She smirked as she figured he didn't know who lived there and hoped Ivy tore him apart so that they could then help Harley. She watched as he jumped high in the air from a building several yards away before he seemed to teleport right in front of the door to the greenhouse and go inside. What an idiot, Catwoman thought to herself as she continued running before swinging over and stopping in front of the door. There's no way he's coming out of there alive once Ivy finds him if she isn't already inside. Suddenly, she heard a shout, followed by some loud crashing, with more words being spoken, and then silence. However, she didn't hear any crying, screams of pain, or begging and was confused, so she decided to open the door and was instead surprised to find not only was Harley being taken care of, but both Ivy and Ash were working together. What the hell is going on? Catwoman screamed as Ivy turned around to look at her with a surprised look on her face while Ash, though she couldn't tell if he was looking at her, seemed to lift his head slightly in her direction. Neither Ivy nor Ash knew what to do aside from looking at each other before Ivy said in a very sarcastic voice, "I think you forgot to tell me something," which made Ash chuckle nervously. Before Catwoman arrived, just after Ash entered the gardens. Ash had just entered the botanical gardens and immediately rushed over to the table where he normally placed his weapons and carefully laid the unconscious woman on it. Then, he quickly moved over to the cabinet, where Ivy held her medical supplies. Gently placing the bag he'd taken from Catwoman to the side, Ash grabbed some gauze, disinfectant, string, needles, and a set of tweezers. After gathering his supplies, Ash began moving back to the unconscious and bleeding women before he felt vines grab his legs as he heard a shout, "What the hell are you doing?" The vines then yanked him in the air, upside down once again, with the sudden force causing Ash to drop all of the equipment he was holding. Seeing Ivy speed walking towards him brought Ash a sense of déjà vu as he recalled their first meeting. She then stopped in front of him, a sneer on her face as she asked, "Just what the hell did you do to Harley?" "Ivy, calm down," Ash said as he held his hands up the best he could before motioning to the now named Harley. "I found her in an alley in a pile of garbage and broken crates. I had no idea who she was until just now when you said her name, and I brought her here to try and help her." Hearing this, Ivy began calming down, glad that Ash hadn't hurt her best friend and let him down as she helped pick up the medical supplies he'd grabbed and moved over to Harley's side as she said, "Come on, if we're going to help her, we're gonna need to work together to do it." With that, Ash joined Ivy on Harley's other side as they both got ready to start until they heard a shout of, "What the hell is going on?" The two looked to see Catwoman standing there, panting with sweat dripping down her face before Ivy looked back at Ash and said sarcastically, "I think you forgot to tell me something." Ash chuckled nervously as he rubbed the back of his head and said, "Yeah, it might have slipped my mind in favor of rushing here to help Harley here." Ivy shook her head, unable to keep herself from chuckling as she said, "Why do I have a feeling this is going to be a normal thing for you?" Ash shrugged before looking at Catwoman and saying, "If you're here for that statue, you're not getting it back, but if you're here for Harley, then you're more than welcome to lend a hand. We could use the help." At this, Ivy grew serious again and looked back at Catwoman before saying, "He's right, Harley's been hurt, bad. The more hands we get, the better her chances will be." Seeing that she wasn't going to get any answers, Catwoman sighed in frustration before quickly making her way over to the others while taking off her clawed gloves and putting them aside as she joined Ash and Ivy and asked, "How can I help?" Ivy, after nodding in thanks to Catwoman, looked to Ash and said, "We need to remove her costume, all of it, so we can see just how badly she's hurt." Nodding his head, Ash pulled out one of his shuriken before breaking one of the blades off and then using the single blade to start cutting Harley's costume open, starting from the opening that the piece of wood had created. Ivy and Catwoman noticed Ash's patience and careful hands as he cut his way up Harley's side before turning up towards her collarbone and neck. They watched as he never put his hands in places they didn't belong, focusing solely on cutting open Harley's costume. Eventually, Ash managed to cut open the neck part of Harley's costume and immediately, all of them noticed Harley breathing far more easily now. With that, he continued cutting Harley's costume, being careful not to cut her while Ivy and Catwoman noticed he never used this as a chance to touch Harley's body and only focused on getting her costume off. After a few minutes, Ash had finally managed to cut off Harley's costume, allowing the trio to see Harley's fair skin was covered in bruises, with several areas around her back and abdomen turning purple. They even saw how her limbs were not only bruised and turning purple but were also slightly mangled, showing they were broken. "Right femur, broken," Ash said as he lightly squeezed Harley's purple thigh, getting her to flinch unconsciously. "Tender, potentially fractured ribs and abdomen," he said after lightly feeling Harley's bruised sides, along with broken ulna and radius on the left arm, after lightly raising Harley's left arm, showing the bones lightly pushing against the inside of Harley's arm. "Strained cervical vertebrae from C2 to C5. Potential fractures in thoracic and lumbar vertebrae from T4 to T8 and L1 to L3, Ash said after carefully feeling and lightly pushing along Harley's spine from the top down. Lastly, potential trauma to organs, but so far, no tears or ruptures, Ash said as he lightly pressed on Harley's stomach while seeing no more blood come out from Harley's mouth aside from the bit that had dripped down when he'd found her. Aside from internal injuries, external injuries consist of a medium-sized piece of wood sticking out of her left side, a few cuts, scrapes, and a small head injury, Ash described while looking over Harley's body, making sure he hadn't missed anything. While Ash was going over Harley's injuries, both Ivy and Catwoman looked at him in surprise, as they had never expected him to have been skilled in the medical field but quickly shook their heads, wanting to focus on saving their friend. With that, the three began to work together as Ivy and Catwoman followed Ash's instructions to make sure they helped set Harley's bones back in place. They disinfected her injuries, and at the end, Ash carefully sewed up Harley's side. After 2 hours involving Ivy calling up a large flower made into a makeshift bed, Harley was now resting peacefully, showing no signs of pain with some bandages wrapped on her head. Her left arm was now in a sling with a cast made from plants that matched the one on her right leg, with a blanket covering her still naked body. Meanwhile, Ivy and Catwoman were resting while Ash was washing his hands, as he had been the one to not only remove the piece of wood and its splinters from Harley's side but had also sewn up her wound. After washing his hands, Ash walked over to Catwoman and Ivy before saying, most of her injuries mainly consisted of her broken leg and arm, her fractured spine, and the wood that had stabbed into her side. She'll be unconscious for a few days, possibly a week, but for the most part, she should make a full recovery in a few months, 4 at the most, while her leg and arm should be healed in about 2. Hearing this, Ivy nodded and said, "Thank you, Ash, but how did you know what to do?" "What do you mean?" "What she means is," Catwoman started, "how did you know how to help Harley, and how do you have skills and knowledge in medicine?" Ash thought about that, as now that they brought it up, even he wondered how he knew what to do before saying, "I don't know." At this, both Ivy and Catwoman looked at Ash, with Ivy asking, "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't know," Ash said before sitting down on a chair and continuing, "I have no memory of my past, so even I don't know how I have my skills or knowledge." Wait, Catwoman said, "Nothing? So you have absolutely no memory or anything about who you are or where you learned medicine or how to fight?" Ash shook his head as he said, "No, I only know my name is Ash, but even then, I feel that isn't completely right." At this, both Catwoman and Ivy couldn't help but feel bad for him. Ivy even more so, since he'd been living with her for a few days now and she hadn't at all tried to learn about him or his situation before they heard Ash say, "But," they then looked at him as he looked at his hands and said, "I don't think my memories are completely gone. The night I first met you, Ivy, I had a small moment where I saw someone I think I was close to, and again just before, I can feel that I was taught these skills by someone close to me. So I don't think I've lost my memories forever, and that I've just lost them for now, but I'll get them back." Ash then clutched his hands into fists as he said, "I can feel it." At the determination in his voice, neither Catwoman nor Ivy could stop the smile from appearing on their faces before Ivy stood up and stretched as she said, "Well, it's late, and I believe we're all tired, so I suggest we get some rest." She then turned to Catwoman and asked, "Will you be staying as well?" "Sure, I don't see why not," Catwoman said while both of them began heading downstairs. "Good night you two," Ash called out, getting both to say the same, as he moved over to a flower bed that hadn't been filled with plants yet and kneeled on it, resting his hands on his thighs before beginning to meditate. Meanwhile, at the Batcave, several nights of searching, and we still haven't found a single trace of this guy, or thing, or whatever they are. Barbara groaned as she sat in a chair in front of a workbench, with her cowl down, while Bruce sat in front of the Bat computer, typing away and searching through various video feeds. "We know they're out there," Bruce said, not looking away from the screens, "we've just gotta keep looking. There's bound to be something. A slip-up, a footprint, another shuriken that was left behind. We just have to find it. What about trying to get eyewitnesses from after they first appeared?" a young, male voice asked. The owner of this voice was a young boy with short black hair. He wore a dark green domino mask that covered his eyes but left the rest of his face bare. He was also wearing green tights under a red Kevlar leotard with short green sleeves, yellow fastenings, and a yellow R on the left side of his chest. He also wore green gloves just before his elbow and matching green boots that went up to his knees with a dark green cape with yellow lining and a yellow utility belt to finish. This was Tim Drake, the third and most recent person to assume the mantle of Robin after the death of the previous Robin, Jason Todd, who was killed by the Joker in an explosion several months ago. Because by now, Bruce started, most of those witnesses won't perfectly recall all the details or even the order that everything happened. That doesn't mean we can't still try, right? Tim asked before he said, "I mean, the police do it all the time, so why can't we?" "Probably because the police usually have an idea of who they're looking for, Tim," Barbara said as she walked behind him and ruffled his hair, getting him to shoo away her hands as he got a frustrated look from her messing with his hair. "She's right, Tim," Bruce said as he pulled up what little footage and evidence they had thanks to Commissioner Gordon. "We only have what we have now thanks to the one camera in the store, but aside from that, we've got nothing else to work with. What we're trying to do is find a shadow, whereas the police are trying to follow a suspect. Actually, I might have some light to shed on that shadow of ours," a voice rang out, setting Tim on edge while Bruce and Barbara simply turned in a direction with Tim looking there as well. Walking out of the shadows, Tim was greeted by what could have been a female Batman as she wore an almost exact replica of Bruce's costume. It was still skin-tight, showing this woman's curvy and toned body that could only have been obtained from harsh training and years of fighting. The costume showed the woman's toned, heart-shaped ass, tight stomach, and DD cup S. However, unlike Batman's, this woman's costume was all black with the boots, gloves, utility belt, cape lining, and symbol all being a fiery red that matched her hair that flowed out from her cowl. "Who are you?" Tim asked, still slightly on edge because he didn't know this woman, but also a little relaxed because he saw how neither Barbara nor Bruce were surprised by this woman's sudden appearance. "I'm Batwoman," the now revealed Batwoman introduced before she took off her cowl, revealing her pale face, gray eyes, and pinned red hair that matched her full, red lips. "However, I'm also Bruce's cousin, Catherine Kane." Sometime after Ash had landed on Earth, in a remote area in space. "Remember," a short, feminine figure said, "stealth is key, patience is speed, and shadows are our friends." Yes, I know. You've told me this several times already." A larger male figure said, "Can we just get on with the mission already? Be patient. We must wait until the Lotus gives us our objectives before proceeding." Rhino, Ivara, as the now revealed Ivara said this. Lotus contacted them, "It's time. Secure the data caches from the Grineer, but do not let them set off the alarm, or they will start destroying the data." Finally, Rhino exclaimed as he picked up his hammer, Frager, and placed it against his back as he moved towards the door. "Hey Ivara. Hurry and open this door. I want to get started already." Ivara shook her head but moved to open the door anyway as she said, "Just remember not to let your loud voice be the reason we get caught and remember the plan. We both split off to go to separate data vaults and then meet at the last one together." Yeah, I know already," Rhino said, waving Ivara off as she finished hacking the door open. "Now come on. The sooner we get this done, the sooner we'll be able to track down where our brother escaped to." With that, Ivara and Rhino sprinted out the door, quickly taking to the shadows as they both went to their respective targets. A few minutes later, "I thought I said, stealth is key. So what did you do?" Ivara's voice rang out over the loud alarms as she rode on Rhino's shoulder while he charged through enemy after enemy, using his iron skin ability to protect himself when not charging through enemies. The two were currently trying to rush through the Grineer base so that they could reach the final data vault before the information was purged and destroyed. "I was stealthy," Rhino shouted back as he backhanded a Grineer while shoulder-checking another. "Then why is the alarm going off?" "Well, I accidentally set off the alarm when I finished the hack on my vault," Rhino shouted as he jumped down a few levels, landing on top of a Grineer that exploded from his weight and killing several more with the shockwave made by his landing. "This is exactly why I told you to practice before we arrived," Ivara shouted as she smacked the back of Rhino's head. "You knew we were going to be hacking to get the information we needed, so why didn't you practice?" "I did practice. Clearly not enough." Just as the two reached the last data vault, an announcement went off. "Data purge complete. All classified data has been destroyed." At this, Rhino skidded to a stop as both he and Ivara heard the announcement. Luckily, they had managed to find an area that was clear of Grineer, allowing them to process what they had just heard. "We're too late," Ivara said, head down in despair and sadness emanating from her voice. "Damn it," Rhino exclaimed as he smashed a crate. "I should have practiced more or been faster." Before Ivara or Rhino could go further into despair, Lotus' voice rang out in their minds, "Do not despair. We will just have to make do with the information we've obtained. For now, head to extraction, and we will discuss our next move from there." Hearing Lotus' calm voice, Ivara said, "She's right. Now's not the time for us to wallow in despair." "Yeah," Rhino said as he nodded, "we got 2 vaults out of the 3, and until we find out what we got, we can't lose focus. Not when we're this close." Ivara nodded, not at all surprised by Rhino's seriousness as she'd known that when the situation called for it, he held the same level of discipline and maturity that earned him the title of General. "Agreed, now let's get moving," Ivara said. "The sooner we get to extraction, the sooner we can start decrypting the data we've got." Rhino nodded and was about to continue his charge through the Grineer base, but something caught his eye as he kneeled, looking inside the crate he'd smashed open. Ivara, confused at Rhino's action, asked, "What are you doing?" "Look what I found," Rhino said as he held up a dark, jagged bone. Ivara could see a small layer of dust getting wiped off from Rhino's thumb, showing that the bone looked to be an extremely dark red color, most likely from aging. "Why are you wasting time picking up a fossil?" Ivara asked. "We need to get to extraction." I know, Rhino said as he stood up and passed the fossil to Ivara. "Just take it and hold it for me. I just have this feeling that it'll be useful in the future." Hearing the determination in Rhino's voice, Ivara shrugged her shoulders as she placed the fossil in the pouch she had, careful not to put it anywhere it could break before closing it as Rhino began moving again, running towards extraction. Present, Gotham City. A few days had passed since Batwoman had shown up at the Batcave and introduced herself to Robin. After arriving, she'd proceeded to tell the group how she'd seen their mysterious newcomer and how he'd run off with a heavily injured Harley Quinn and Catwoman on their heels. Hearing this information, Batman had begun drawing conclusions about this potentially being a new ally for Harley Quinn and a potential rival for Catwoman, as Batwoman had mentioned the bag the newcomer had been holding. Batman had enough trouble when dealing with the likes of the Joker, Two-Face, Black Mask, and the other villains he usually dealt with, and he did not need another rogue to deal with. Right now, it was the middle of the night and Batman, Batgirl, Batwoman, and Robin all stood on a roof in the middle of Gotham. Batman overlooked Gotham while the others looked at him, waiting for him to say what the plan was and what they needed to do. Based on the information we received from Batwoman, Batman began as he turned to look at the others. "We can suspect that our unknown may go looking for medical supplies to resupply after they recovered a heavily injured Harley Quinn." "How do you know she was hurt that badly?" Robin asked, curious as to how Batman knew this. Sigh. After a deep sigh, Batman looked directly at Robin as he responded, "Because I was there when she got pushed out of a window by Joker." This information got everyone's attention as they knew Joker was crazy, homicidal, and cruel. They even knew about when Dr. Harleen Quinzel first joined his side and how the two had gotten into a relationship. While she loved the Joker and was devoted to being his sidekick, the Joker was extremely cruel to her and would often beat or throw her out. However, hearing how the Joker sent Harley Quinn flying out of a window brought their already low opinion of the Joker even lower. "Okay," Batgirl cut in, "but that still doesn't explain why you think they'd go looking for medical supplies tonight. For all we know, they could have gone at some point in the last few nights." Batman shook his head and said, "No, they wouldn't have gone in the last few days. If they had the means to perform emergency aid, they wouldn't need to resupply for at least a few years. However, that's only for basic emergency aid. For Harley's injuries, those supplies would only last a few days." Hearing this, the rest of the Bat family realized that Batman was right, as a typical building or household would last for a few years before running out, but only for the most basic of injuries, such as scrapes and cuts. Now, Batman began as he turned back to look over Gotham. "We're going to spread throughout Gotham to keep an eye out for them in case they appear. Stay as close to each other as you can while maintaining your positions so we can regroup quickly if they do show up." Hearing the plan, they all nodded in agreement before they all took off in separate directions, heading to their positions relatively close to pharmacies and hospitals. After they each got into place, the most grueling part of this plan came. Waiting. Meanwhile, while Batman and his team had moved into place, we can see Ash and Poison Ivy looking over the still unconscious Harley Quinn. It had been a few days since Ash brought Harley to the Botanical Gardens and performed a minor surgery with the help of Poison Ivy and Catwoman. Catwoman had left the following day, not because she wasn't worried, but because Ash had indeed kept his word and returned the jade statue to the museum just before dawn. This action irritated Catwoman, leaving so that she could calm down, not wanting to risk shouting and/or fighting, which would disrupt Harley's recovery. Ash was checking her injuries and changing her bandages when he finished while Ivy was making herself some tea. From the looks of her injuries, Ash began as he checked Harley's stitched up side. "I think she's recovering rather well. I don't see any signs of infection or other wounds that could have been sustained from whatever happened to her." As he finished going over her wounds, he wrapped new bandages on Harley, taking great care not to disturb her injuries or add too much pressure. Then, double-checking his work, Ash nodded in satisfaction, happy with Harley's recovery, before walking away with the tray he'd used to hold any medical supplies he'd need for her checkup. "That's good," Ivy said as she poured her tea into a cup and blew on it a bit before taking a sip. not needing to wait as long for her tea to cool thanks to her powers giving her a slight edge and durability. I'm glad she's going to be okay. When do you think she'll wake up? Hearing this, Ash stopped checking his supplies as he cupped his chin and said, well, so long as she hasn't taken any hits to the head, or she doesn't have a concussion, she should wake up in possibly the next day or two. But, unfortunately, in terms of healing enough to move around, that won't be for at least a few weeks, possibly a few months, as her limbs were quite badly broken. Ivy nodded when she heard this, fully understanding that Harley was an average person. Very athletic and flexible, as she recalled during some of her and Harley's more intimate get-togethers, but an ordinary person nonetheless. It would take time for Harley to recover completely, but at least she was here instead of Arkham or wherever the Joker was so that he wouldn't be able to keep his filthy hooks in her again. That's good, Ivy said. I feel bad that this was how it happened, but at least she's finally away from the Joker. Hopefully, I can convince her to break away from him for good. Oh no. At Ash's words, Ivy's head quickly whipped around, not wanting anything bad to be happening to Harley, only to relax when she saw him looking through their shared medical supplies. What's wrong? Shaking his head, Ash grabbed the bag that Catwoman had initially used to hold the statue and his pouch of gems and gold and said, "Oh, nothing's wrong. I need to go out for more supplies as we're beginning to run low." Ivy made a confused face at this, "But how are you going to get supplies looking like that?" she said as she gestured to his entire body. Looking at himself, Ash realized that Ivy had a point, and he couldn't go to a store and purchase supplies like this without people freaking out or even having the local law enforcement getting called. I see your point, Ash replied, though we still need supplies. Any suggestions on where I could go? Poison Ivy held her chin as she hummed in thought before she snapped her fingers and said, "Why not go to one of the hospitals and break into their clinic? It may not be ideal, considering you don't want to be viewed as a criminal, but I think it'll be fine if you leave a note and some money or something to pay them back for what you take and any damages." At the mention of money, Ash grabbed his pouch from his side and asked, "Would this work?" He then opened the pouch and handed it to Poison Ivy, who looked inside, and her eyes grew wide at all the gems, precious stones, and pieces of gold and silver she saw. "Where'd you get this?" Ivy exclaimed in a hushed tone to not wake up Harley. "This much could be a small fortune, maybe more if you find the right person to buy them." Ivy was simply unable to understand where and how Ash, Mr. I will not commit a crime unless necessary, could get this much without having an open warrant for his arrest. Taking the pouch and closing it back up, Ash put it back on his waist with a shrug and said, "I got it a few weeks ago from some friends before I left their island. They gave it to me in case I ever needed money, and I haven't had a reason to use any of it until now." Ivy could only nod her head as she said, "Well, so long as the only thing you break is the lock on the door and maybe some glass, I think you'll only need to leave 2, maybe 3 gems, and that should just about cover any damages you cause and anything you take." "Thank you," Ash said as he nodded his head. "I probably would have left half of my bag or all of it if you hadn't told me." With that, Ash quickly left the gardens as he began heading towards a hospital, hoping to find a clinic or the hospital was closed, and the supplies hadn't been relocated by the medical staff yet. Later that night, it had been a few hours since Batman, and the rest of the Bat family had split up, prepared and ready to act if they spotted their mysterious warrior. Batman was on the roof of a building equidistant from a hospital that had recently closed down and a family-owned clinic that was closed for the night. Batman figured that this was a good spot if only because the warrior could come to the hospital, unaware that it was empty and scheduled for demolition in 2 days, and then upon realizing this, would move to the clinic. "Just who are you?" Batman thought to himself as he looked over the only clear picture he and his team had of this unknown warrior, "and what are you planning to do?" Suddenly, an alert went off, and Batman pulled up a small tablet to see that it was the clinic he'd scouted and had connected to the security system. Tapping the screen, the alert shut off as Batman could see Ash had indeed arrived and had broken one of the skylights to get inside. At this, Batman put the tablet away, turning it off automatically, as he began rushing towards the clinic and opened his comms as he said, "Everyone, they've appeared." At this, Batman received a reply from Batwoman as she said, "Where are you?" "I'm heading towards the Dreyer family's clinic," Batman replied as he shot his Batclaw grappling hook and swung to a roof across a wide street. "Head to the Dreyer clinic and be prepared for a chase if they escape." "Understood. Okay, see ya." came the replies of Batwoman, Robin, and Batgirl, respectively. With that, Batman cut off communication as he jumped across another roof and ran to the edge, as he finally came to the clinic, broken skylight and all. With that, Batman shot his Batclaw out as he used it to slow his fall and gently land on the clinic's roof. Then, walking over to the broken skylight, Batman jumped down, not making a sound aside from the light crunching of the glass on the floor. At this, Batman tensed as he looked around, ready for a potential attack, only to deadpan as his shoulders dropped once he realized he was in an empty bathroom. With that, Batman exited the bathroom as he walked through the clinic. Eventually, Batman made his way to the main part of the clinic, where he saw the mysterious warrior going through various drawers and cabinets of medicine and supplies. However, what surprised Batman was that despite all the drugs that were right in front of them, they ignored most and simply went through grabbing select items. Focusing on the figure, Batman could hear them mumbling, "Let's see, I've got bandages, surgical string, needles, and painkillers. I just need some antibiotics and maybe something for tetanus just in case." Just as they were about to move on, Batman decided to make his move as he said, "I don't think so." At the voice, the figure spun around to see the Dark Knight as he walked out of the shadows and into view. Clutching his bag of supplies tightly, Ash quickly jumped onto the railing of the floor above him as he said, well, the Dark Knight himself. "What brings you here?" Fairly quick reaction speed and physically strong, possibly from the suit, Batman thought, analyzing the mysterious figure to possibly get more data aside from what he could collect from the video recording of him. Add in his speed and skills in using those twin scythes on his back and the shuriken he carries, he could be a high-ranking assassin or someone who was released from the League who started making his own style of weapons. "I received a recording of your little debut at the jewelry store that was being robbed," Batman said, not lying but also not wanting to give too much away in case the figure turned out to be one who didn't care who they killed. "I'm here to know what your intentions are in my city." Batman watched as the figure crouched on the railing, wholly relaxed but ready to move in an instant as they scratched the side of their head and hummed in thought before saying, "Intentions in your city? I wasn't aware that you owned Gotham?" At this, Batman narrowed his eyes. "Of course, I don't own Gotham. However, this is the city that I protect," he replied. "If you protect Gotham, why do you beat up its inhabitants?" "I don't beat up the people of Gotham," Batman exclaimed, getting frustrated at the figure's remarks. "So you don't beat people into unconsciousness for dealing with their business?" The figure asked as they disappeared from Batman's sight, followed by the creaking of cabinets being opened, meaning they'd gone back to searching for supplies, but Batman couldn't pinpoint where. Batman narrowed his eyes as he clenched his fists and exclaimed, "If you're talking about those who deal in weapons, drugs, and human trafficking, then I'll stop them. Their business would only cause more harm to the citizens of Gotham who want to live in peace." As he said this, Batman could hear several more cabinets being opened and closed but could never pinpoint their location as the sound seemed to have reverberated throughout the entire clinic. The same for the figure's voice as they asked, "What about those who didn't have a choice?" Batman's annoyance with the figure's trick and annoying questions froze, stopping him dead in his tracks as the figure continued, "What if, out of all those criminals you beat down and sent to jail, there were those who had no choice but to resort to a life of crime because of the world that let them slip through the cracks?" Even if that were true, Batman began, calming down as he realized that the previous questions were simply building up to this. There is a system. Simply because something bad happens, it does not give anyone the right to turn to crime as a solution. "Oh?" The voice began, the tone showing they were intrigued by Batman's response. "So what you're saying is that people should seek help from a system that chooses who gets help and who doesn't based on the amount of wealth they do or do not have. Or whether they are useful or not. That's not at all what I meant," Batman exclaimed, getting rather annoyed at this figure twisting his words. "Oh, but I think you did," the figure said, Batman now turning rapidly and looking around, trying to catch a glimpse of them. "After all, you said so yourself. When something bad happens, it doesn't give anyone the right to turn to crime. So, even if a person is in a position where they want to receive help or find a job or any legal way to make money and survive, the system will ignore them if they don't have the proper skills or monetary status. So, should a person like that really continue to have faith and belief in a system that doesn't believe in or give a damn about them or give them a chance? Yes, they should," Batman exclaimed, beginning to reach his boiling point. "The system is there because nobody is exempt from the law. Then you, Mr. Dark and oh so very gloomy, are a massive hypocrite, the voice said from above. At this, Batman looked up as he tightened his fists in frustration to see the figure was now standing outside the skylight. What frustrated Batman even more to the point that he started gritting his teeth was the cheeky wave the figure was making before turning and running. With that, Batman used his Batclaw and flew towards the skylight, shielding his face and eyes from the glass as he burst through. Landing on the roof, Batman quickly looked around before he spotted the figure as they dropped out of view in the distance. At that, Batman charged forward, jumping across rooftops, swinging himself with his Batclaw, and not letting anything stop him as he contacted the others. Everyone, converge on my position, Batman commanded as he finally caught sight of the figure once again. Batman, Batgirl's voice came as she and everyone were surprised when they suddenly heard Batman ordering them, "What's going on?" "I encountered the suspect at the clinic near my position," Batman said as he swung to another roof using his Batclaw as he finally caught sight of his target. "I'm currently in pursuit. We're heading east from the Dreyer family clinic." "Roger that. Okay, we'll meet you there." The voices of Batwoman, Robin, and Batgirl came as Batman cut off communications with them and focused on chasing down the suspect. Meanwhile, as Batman focused on trying to catch up, Ash was calmly striding and jumping across the buildings as he thought about a way to lose the detective. He could turn invisible, but that took a moment to concentrate if he used the advanced version of his ability. Meanwhile, the usual way wouldn't last too long and was more likely to backfire if the detective was to throw something at him before he could entirely vanish. "I do wish he'd simply leave me be," Ash thought to himself as he bullet jumped across another open space between buildings. "It's not like I hurt anyone aside from those criminals I saw a while ago. I also left some gems for compensation and a note of apology for breaking the glass and locks on the cabinets. So it's not as if I'm robbing the owners. I simply can't make an appearance during the day." As Ash jumped over another satellite dish, he was surprised when the bag containing the supplies he'd gathered was snatched from his possession. As he landed on the next roof, he quickly turned towards where he felt his bag be grabbed from. To his surprise, it was a young woman, possibly in her late teens, but no more than 20, who'd used some type of grappling hook to take the bag from him. Even without the mask or tight bodysuit, he could see that she would have been beautiful. However, the only thing Ash could focus on was the bag she presently held. "I believe that belongs to me," Ash said, pointing towards the bag as the girl observed him, "so if you could hand it back to me, I'd be extremely grateful." Suddenly, Ash heard two other flutters of cloth and fabric and looked to see a grown woman with red hair in a similar costume to the detective except black with a red bat symbol and a young boy, possibly younger than the young woman who was currently holding his bag, wearing a red, black, and yellow outfit with a yellow R on the left side of his chest. "Judging by how you three are dressed, I'm going to take a wild guess and say you all work with the detective, yes?" "That's right," Batwoman said as she, Robin, and Batgirl were ready in case the mysterious warrior tried anything, "and if you don't mind, we'd like to ask you a few questions regarding your stay in Gotham and the company you keep." As he wouldn't be going anywhere anytime soon without a chase throughout Gotham, Ash nodded as he replied, "All right, but may I please have my bag returned to me? I do need the supplies inside." At this, Batgirl shook her head as she said, "Sorry, but all stolen goods have to either be returned to the owners or handed over to the police, and since we're not trying to take you down and hand you over to the police yet, these'll just go right back to the pharmacy." "But I am the owner," Ash said, getting their attention, "as I paid for the supplies I took and the locks and skylight I broke. Though the detective back there broke the skylight in a different section of the clinic, so I won't be paying for that." "What do you mean you paid for the stuff in the bag?" Robin asked as he scratched his head. Opening the pouch on his side, Ash grabbed a piece of silver and tossed it at Batwoman, who caught it in her hand as she looked it over. At the same time, Ash replied, "I left a note apologizing for any broken locks and cabinets the owners may find, as well as the glass I had broken in their bathroom, while also leaving behind a piece of gold, a piece of silver, and a rather nice blue gemstone. All of which I own as they were a gift from some friends before I left their island in the odd event that I require money of some kind." As Ash said all this, Batwoman pulled out a small, handheld device and scanned the piece of silver Ash had tossed at her to show that it was authentic as she subtly nodded while looking at both Robin and Batgirl. Batgirl then jumped down and walked over towards Ash, who she noted didn't seem tense during her approach, But why do all this in the first place? She asked despite already knowing the answer. Because someone I know is currently in a lot of pain and requires the necessary medical supplies, all of which I did not have. Why not just call for help or even go to a clinic? At this, Ash shook his head as he replied, I could not trust that anywhere I went would not report my appearance or who it was I wanted to help. However, it was brought to my attention that I could not simply walk amongst the masses in broad daylight with my appearance. So, I chose to wait until nightfall when no one would be around to secure the necessary supplies I needed without drawing much attention to myself. Ash then briefly looked at Batwoman and Robin before saying, clearly, that was a pointless endeavor. Now standing in front of Ash, Batgirl looked at him. Realizing he was probably just an inch or so taller than her as she said, usually if you were a normal thief, we would have had to turn you in and then return the stolen goods or simply hand them to the cops. However, I think we can all agree that you aren't a thief, simply a man trying to help someone despite circumstances making it hard. At this, Batgirl held out the bag of medical supplies to Ash, who slowly reached for the bag, not wanting to risk it being a trap or make any sudden moves in case it set off the other two because they thought he was trying something. Unfortunately, just as he was about to grab hold of the bag, Ash's head twitched to the side before he jumped back as several flying objects slammed into where he had just been standing, showing they were bat-shaped pieces of metal. Landing on a chimney, Ash and the others looked to see Batman had finally caught up, though he was also breathing a little hard from the long chase. Batman, Broody? Batgirl and Ash said, with Batgirl being surprised at Batman's appearance while Ash simply tilted his head. Huh, Ash said, I was expecting you to take a little longer than that. You must have been either very annoyed or very determined. Batman glared at Ash before looking at Batgirl and asking, why were you about to hand over the bag? We should be returning the medical supplies and restraining. Batman glanced at Ash as he said, it. Hearing how much Broody stressed the last word, Ash got frustrated as he exclaimed, I am not an it. All four members of the Bat family were surprised at the sudden outburst, not having expected that. As Batwoman said, he meant nothing by it. It's just that we had no way of knowing how to address you. Ash crossed his arms, showing his displeasure at the brief title as he replied, my name is Ash, and I hate being called an it. Why? Batwoman asked, wanting to know the reason behind the outburst. Ash shrugged his shoulders, not uncrossing his arms, as he said, don't know, don't care. I hate being called an it. I have a name, so use it. Ash then looked towards Batgirl as he held out his hand and asked, now, may I please have that back? I have a friend who needs help, and the supplies in there are for them. Batgirl was going to hand over the bag until Batman moved his arm in front of her, stopping her progression as he said, we don't hand over stolen medical supplies to criminals. Ash groaned as they dragged their hands down their face and said, as I've already told the others, Broody, I did not steal those supplies. I left payment for the supplies, the broken locks, and the glass that I broke on the counter with a note of apology and an explanation. Not to mention, that bag is mine as the previous owner left it behind after we had a minor disagreement. Fine, Batman said, you may be innocent enough regarding these supplies, but what about the group of men you injured and killed a few days ago? You don't expect us just to let you go, do you? Do you mean the trash that was going to kill the people in the store? Ash asked, tensing up as he prepared himself in case there was a fight. Are you telling me that some of them died? Hearing this, Robin stepped up and said, yeah, some died from blood loss because of having their femoral artery severed, another died from having his arms cut off, and the last one died from the shock caused by the extreme amount of pain they were in from having all of their joints and bones broken. All died within a few hours of being taken by paramedics. Ash hummed as he replied, I should have aimed better. I could have made them suffer longer. At this, Batman stalked forward as he asked, so you admit to having killed them? I admit to having attacked them, however, I never aimed to kill. I figured the pain would be enough, and the longer they lived, the more they would have suffered. So no, I don't admit to killing them. That was just what happened due to a lack of medical equipment, Ash pointed out to the Bat-themed hero. And the one whose arms you cut off? Batman questioned with a tense tone. I wasn't thinking very much about the welfare of that particular criminal, Ash admitted with a shrug. I was more focused on the welfare of the hostages, so I just did what first came to my mind to disable the criminal. Unfortunately for them, it just so happened to involve permanently disabling them. It's not up to you whether someone gets punished or not, Batman growled out. That's a job for the justice system. And yet you do the exact same thing? Ash questioned as he crossed his arms. You tell me that I cannot decide whether someone should be punished or not, and yet, that is exactly what you do. As Ash brought this up, Batgirl, Batwoman, and Robin couldn't help but frown as Ash said this, not wanting to believe they spoke of doing one thing yet doing another. I don't maim my enemies or give them a permanent disability, Batman says in response, for villains like Joker and Scarecrow, despite all they do, putting them in jail is far better than killing them. And yet, Ash began, if you'd only kill them, then so many innocent people wouldn't lose their lives every time they break out of prison. At this, Batman charged at Ash, fully intending to take him down. However, just as he made it to Ash, the space around him distorted as he disappeared from sight. Suddenly, he heard Batgirl release a gasp and spun around to see that Batgirl had been knocked to the floor and was no longer holding the bag of medical supplies as he and the others began looking around for Ash. Well, as fun as this was, came Ash's voice as the 4 members of the Bat family turned and saw him on a roof a bit away from them, now holding his bag once again. I do believe it's time for me to leave. After all, I have a patient waiting for me, and they are in desperate need of these supplies. So with that, good night, and hopefully, we can have a better meeting in the future. At this, Ash gave a 2-finger salute as he tossed something towards them as he turned and then disappeared in another burst of distorted space with the tiniest burst of dirt from the ground. While Batwoman and Robin jumped up to see if they could catch a glimpse of Ash, Batgirl and Batman picked up what Ash had tossed towards them and found that it had been the tracker she had placed inside the bag. He's not like any of the others we've faced before, is he? Batgirl asked Batman as she clenched her hand around the tracker. Batman shook his head as he said, no, he's not. He's much smarter than any of the others we've faced and far more cunning and dangerous. He doesn't just know how to fight, he's a killer, and he attacks people's minds, their mentality, trying to poke a hole and worm his way in until he can manipulate them the way he wants. At this, Batgirl looked in the direction they had last seen Ash as she thought, I know what I'm doing is to help people, but does he have a point? Are we really nothing but hypocrites who talk about nobody being above the law, and yet we do the very same thing? There he is. Just as she finished the thought, Batgirl and Batman heard Robin shout, as they jumped over to see him pointing down an alley where they saw Ash easily lift a sewer cover and tossed it into the air before jumping down as the cover landed smoothly back, once again covering the hole. Meanwhile, after jumping down the sewers, Ash began calmly walking through the sewers, not caring about the dirty water as he looked through his bag of supplies. Channeling a bit of power into his twisted arms, his arms began to glow, with a majority of it being in his hands, and using the glow, he looked through the bag to see if he was missing anything. I could do with some more gauze, but I suppose I'll have to make do, Ash muttered to himself as he closed the bag and once again hung it over his shoulder as he tightened the strap so that the bag clung tightly across his torso. Walking through the sewers, Ash held up one of his glowing arms to try and extend the range of how far he could see. He knew he'd eventually have to exit the sewers to find his way back. Otherwise, he could potentially be lost for days. Suddenly, Ash heard several splashes from further back behind him and could only guess that Batman and his allies had followed him into the sewers. I guess I'll have to do this in the dark, Ash muttered as he stopped channeling his power into his arms, causing them to start dimming down as they eventually stopped glowing. With that, Ash reached out and let his hand run against the wall as he continued walking, not making a sound, even when walking through the dirty water, while he guided himself by using the wall to keep himself from getting lost. As he walked through the sewers, he made several turns while also trying to find a way out of the sewer until he found himself losing touch with the sewer wall. Curious about where he was, Ash again channeled power into one of his arms as it glowed and showed he had walked into a large area that broke into several tunnels, all of which ran in different directions. Ash hummed as he looked around after walking to the center of the corridor. This might take longer than I thought. Unknown to Ash, the water behind him began to bubble as a large figure silently rose from the water as he looked around. Suddenly, Ash heard growling and quickly turned, only to get smacked away by something powerful as he slammed into one of the walls and fell towards the water. However, he quickly caught himself with his arms and legs as he didn't want to risk the medical supplies getting dirty and ruined due to the sewer water. Slowly standing up, Ash fully channeled his powers back into his arms. letting them glow in full force as he saw what, or more precisely who, attacked him. Looking at the figure, Ash had to tilt his head up as the figure stood at an incredibly imposing 8 feet 6 inches of pure, green scales-covered muscle. The figure's arms were massive as they were huge with muscle and ended in claws at the end of their fingers with scales poking out at the knuckles like natural knuckle dusters. The front of their torso was covered in light gray scales, with some on their biceps as well, while the rest of their body was covered in dark green scales. Finally, they wore a large pair of torn-up, dark blue jeans, large, sharp fangs protruding from their mouth, and glowing, yellow, reptilian eyes. Looking at the figure before him, Ash slowly stood as he asked, "What are you?" However, his question was left unanswered as the creature before him roared at him, before it charged towards him, teeth ready to rip into him should it catch him. Just as the creature was about to grab him, Ash quickly jumped up and kicked off the wall he'd previously crashed into, using it to catapult himself over his opponent as they slammed into the wall, breaking a few chunks off but also disorienting them as Ash watched him for the build and clothing made Ash think it was a male grab his head as he swayed slightly. "I don't know who you are, and I mean you no harm, but I need to get these supplies to someone who needs them. So, just let me pass, and you won't get hurt," Ash said, trying to plead with the creature as he held his hands up in a disarming manner. He watched as the creature shook its head before it looked at him with a predator glare as it growled and began stalking towards him. Ash slowly began to back up but knew there was no way he could simply run as the creature would no doubt chase after him, and with the size of the tunnels in the sewers, it would have no issue following him. Suddenly, it charged at him again as it swung at him, trying to land another blow. However, Ash was ready as he flipped over the arm. Grabbing it mid-swing, he used the creature's own power against it as he used the failed punch to build his momentum as he swung around and slammed his feet into the creature's face, knocking it away as it fell into the dirty water. Not wanting to waste this chance, Ash jumped into the air and landed on its head, slamming it down into the water as he felt its head contact the floor. However, the creature suddenly grabbed his leg, catching him by surprise as he swung through the air before getting thrown into the wall again. Catching himself again, Ash stopped himself from falling into the water but was suddenly slammed into the wall again as the creature charged at him and shoulder bashed him into the wall, further disorienting him. Ash quickly looked up but was suddenly folded over again as the creature began slamming punches into his body. Watching the creature, Ash waited as he began timing the punches, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. Suddenly, the creature backed up as it lifted both its fists into the air, planning to dual hammer-arm him as he jumped into its guard before grabbing its head and using it as leverage as he lifted himself up before slamming his knee into its face, knocking it back. Not wanting to give up this moment, Ash began to punch it in the face, getting it to continue to back up before he noticed it try to grab him in a bear hug as he dropped down before flipping up and slamming his foot into the top of its head. The creature growled but was cut off as Ash slammed a flying roundhouse into its face, using the dirt and grime to blind it as it roared and began trying to clean its eyes. At this, Ash rushed around it, as he slammed his foot into the back of its knees, knocking it to the ground as he quickly wrapped his arms around its neck, putting it in a chokehold as he began to squeeze with all his might. Now, one would think that due to Ash's size, trying to use a chokehold on a creature with this much size difference would be suicide. However, Ash was far stronger than his size let on. This was shown as Ash began to squeeze, and the creature started to gasp as it made choking sounds while trying to grab Ash to get him off. Unfortunately, the creature had difficulty grasping Ash's arms due to his small size and his opponent's large shoulders. As a result, the creature had difficulty grasping Ash's arms. With this, it resorted to trying to reach behind and grab Ash's body. Seeing this, Ash jumped onto the creature's shoulders as he used his legs to restrain its arms back as it fell forward, Ash being the only thing keeping the creature from drowning as he continued to squeeze. The creature began to struggle even harder as the noises it made got louder as time passed by. It took a long time for the creature to pass out due to its size. Eventually, it slowly struggled less as the noises got quieter and quieter until it stopped moving entirely and even stopped making noises. At this, Ash held on for a little longer, not wanting to risk the creature trying to trick him, until he slowly let go, the creature not waking up as it slipped into blissful unconsciousness. Slowly moving away, Ash moved toward another tunnel before quickly running, not wanting to risk the creature waking up and coming at him again. However, had he stayed longer, he would have seen Batman and his team as they arrived, having heard all the fighting. As they entered the wide corridor, all four looked around before their eyes landed on the unconscious creature as Batgirl and Robin's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh wow," Robin exclaimed in shock, "whoever this Ash guy is, he's seriously strong if he was able to knock out Killer Croc." Batgirl nodded as she moved around the unconscious Croc to look at the surrounding walls. She brought out a flashlight to inspect the walls, having noticed something odd about them, as she said, "No kidding, and if you look, you can see that their fight was something. Even the walls are shattered a bit, and judging by the damage, I can only imagine Killer Croc slammed Ash into them. No normal person, even with a type of armored suit, can withstand Killer Croc's blows for a long time without suffering some serious injuries, and seeing as Ash isn't here, I can only assume that he wasn't badly hurt, if at all, before he took down Killer Croc." While Robin moved over to join Batgirl in examining the walls, Batman and Batwoman crouched near Killer Croc as they began their own examination. Batman and Batwoman used the high-tech lenses in their cowls as they used their detective vision to scan Killer Croc to get a record of his injuries and potentially find out how he was defeated. "I'm seeing multiple forms of blunt force trauma on his arms, focused more on his knuckles and shoulders," Batwoman said, her lenses glowing blue, just like Batman's, as she looked up and down Killer Croc's body, probably from punching and slamming into the wall, most likely due to Ash dodging his attacks. Indeed, Batman agreed, having come to the same conclusion when he noticed the same injuries. "I'm also noticing quite the amount of injuries on his head and face." It seems Ash knew that attacking Killer Croc's body would have been a pointless endeavor due to the amount of muscle he has. However, this level of injury wouldn't be enough to knock out Killer Croc, at least not unless he was beaten a lot more severely. Batwoman nodded, knowing that unless Killer Croc was hit with enough power to crack open a normal human skull in a single hit, it would require many more hits to knock out Killer Croc. However, as she continued going over Killer Croc's body, she saw his neck and noticed something odd. "Batman, help me get access to his neck," Batwoman asked, as Batman moved over to help her adjust Killer Croc a bit so that his neck was more in the open. "What do you see?" Batman asked. Pointing around Killer Croc's neck, Batwoman said, "It looks like his throat has been crushed, almost as if something wrapped around his neck and was choking him." Batman hummed as his lenses changed from blue to red, showing the change in settings of his detective vision. "You're right. I'm seeing a lot of strain in his vocal cords, the muscles in his neck, and even his esophagus. Most likely, Ash is the one who choked Killer Croc, as there's nothing around here that is strong enough to wrap around his throat and choke him before he can break it. But why not do worse?" Batgirl asked as both she and Robin moved back over, having finished inspecting the walls. "I mean, we've seen what he can do based on the video from the jewelry store, and seeing as we all saw his scythes on his back, why not use them to finish Killer Croc quicker or even kill him? Maybe he couldn't pull out his scythes?" Robin suggested with a shrug, as he was just throwing a random guess since none of them could think of a reason why Ash wouldn't just fight with his scythes. "I don't know," Batman admitted, not having any clue as to why Ash didn't use his scythes, "but let's just be glad he didn't use his scythes, as with the skill he's shown when wielding them, I have no doubt in my mind that if he had used them, we'd be looking at a dead Croc instead of a sleeping one." The other three nodded as they began to tie up Killer Croc so that they could transport him out of the sewers to hand him over to Gotham police custody so they could transfer him back to Arkham Asylum. However, even while doing that, all three couldn't help but think about Ash's motives for leaving Killer Croc alive and what this would accomplish. Hours later, it was now midday in Gotham as a manhole cover was lifted before sliding over, causing a grinding sound to ring out as people looked to see what was going on. They all watched as Ash, arms and legs covered in dirt, grime, and filth from the sewers, climbed out. He moved to the side as he lightly kicked the manhole cover back in place as he looked at his arms and legs and finally noticed the filth on them. "I don't think it'd be a good idea to show up like this," Ash said as he looked around before noticing a nearby park and decided to see if he could find something to wash off. Not wanting to risk anything falling on random bystanders, Ash began to run to enter the park as he looked around, trying to see if there was anything he could use to clean himself. Suddenly, Ash noticed a small pond in the middle of the park and ran over before stopping at the edge. Seeing the clean water, Ash felt bad about what he was going to do but decided this was better than going back completely filthy. So walking in, the water beginning to wash away some of the filth on his legs, Ash reached down and started washing off his arms, scrubbing away the grime and filth from the sewers. He knew people were probably looking at him and wondering what he was doing, but he didn't care, mainly because he didn't know any of them. He'd let them think whatever they wanted because, in the end, none of it mattered to him. After a few minutes, he'd finally managed to wash off all the dirt and grime as he walked out of the pond before he looked up and teleported to the roof of a nearby building he'd spotted. With that, he began making his way back to the botanical gardens as he rushed back, not wanting to leave Ivy alone with an unconscious Harley should anything happen. Eventually, he found his way back to the gardens, the water having dripped off his body as he traveled to the gardens whenever he jumped through the air. Entering, he found Harley still asleep, just as she had been when he'd left. However, what he saw made him stop when he caught a glimpse of Poison Ivy. She was still wearing a normal t-shirt and shorts, just as she had been when he left. However, her eyes looked red with bags beginning to develop, showing she hadn't slept much, if at all, last night. As he took off the bag, he watched as she finally glanced his way, surprised to see him as she got up and stomped towards him. Her tired expression still there but now mixed with anger as she exclaimed, "And just where the hell have you been?" Despite her anger, Ash wasn't deterred as he began taking out the supplies he'd gathered and said, "I'm sorry. I got a little held up when I was gathering the supplies." "And what exactly made you take so long?" Ivy shouted again, as she had been worried he'd left and wouldn't be able to give Harley the help she needed, especially after using all the medicine and first aid equipment they had. "I ran into Batman and his team," Ash replied, getting Ivy to stop as she looked at him in surprise as he looked over everything he took out of the bag to make sure he wasn't missing anything, though at first, it was only Batman who'd found me in the clinic and had tried to stop me, though, luckily, it's easy to get away undetected when you distract him when you can succeed in making him question his methods. From there, I had been making my way back but was then forced to stop when the bag was taken by one of his team members, though she and the boy looked quite young to be crime fighters. Sigh, Poison Ivy sighed as she began to relax and leaned against the back of the couch as she said, "From the sounds of it, you met Batgirl and Batman's new Robin. And if there was a woman who had red hair and was dressed similarly to Batman, that was Batwoman, another member of his team." "Ah, so those are their aliases," Ash said as he held his chin and nodded, having finished his count of the supplies he'd gathered. "Well, anyway, after they took the bag from me, I had a talk with them too, and I almost managed to get Batgirl to give me back the bag without a fight. However, Batman chose that moment to catch up as apparently, some men I took down when I first arrived in Gotham had died due to the seriousness of their injuries. This gave them all the image that I'm a murderer, even though I'm not. I simply believe that people who wish to do bad things for horrible, petty reasons deserve proper punishment." At this, Poison Ivy couldn't help but hold her breath as she hoped he wouldn't decide she or, God forbid, Harley needed to be punished and potentially put down if he ever heard about the stuff they'd done. She only gave him a brief look at why she does what she does, but she never told him what she'd done in the past. She knew the night she'd caught him was mainly because he'd been caught by surprise, but she had a feeling, even then, that he could have escaped and killed her if he'd wanted to. Not to mention, Harley was completely defenseless right now, so if he went after her, there'd be nothing she could do to defend herself. Anyway, Ash continued, breaking Ivy from her thoughts, "After it became clear that none of them would listen to me, I teleported to Batgirl, took the bag while sweeping her feet from under her, and teleported to the streets below as I entered the sewers. From there, I lost them but came across this odd creature that looked like a humanoid reptile with massive teeth, green scales, and yellow eyes. We fought, I knocked it unconscious, and then I got lost for several hours until I finally found a way out. Though I was covered in filth, I washed up a bit before finding my way back here." Poison Ivy was shocked when she heard all this, saying, "You met Killer Croc and beat him unconscious?" At this, Ash turned to her as he asked, "Is that his name?" "Huh, I didn't know that, and to be more precise, I beat him, but I choked him unconscious." "Wow," Poison Ivy said as she held her forehead, "this might be the first time I'm ever hearing about Killer Croc, of all people, getting choked out." However, suddenly, something else clicked in her head as she recalled he said he'd been in the sewers. She sniffed the air before recoiling in disgust as she covered her nose and said, "Ew. I know you said you washed up, but you need a proper shower." Seeing her reaction, Ash looked at himself as he said, "But I'm clean? You might look clean, but I can tell you that you definitely don't smell clean." Poison Ivy exclaimed as she moved away from him and pointed towards the stairs, and said, "Head downstairs, go to the end of the hall, bathroom and showers are on the right. I don't care how you do it, but you need to clean yourself better as you reek." Knowing he couldn't smell himself, Ash trusted Poison Ivy as he did as she said and went downstairs to the bathroom and began cleaning himself thoroughly. After a while, he came back up, seeing Ivy waiting for him as she smelled the air and gave him a thumbs up, showing he no longer smelled. With that, all her exhaustion finally caught up to her as she began to sway heavily until she fell before Ash caught her. Neither caring he was still wet as he carried her over to the bed Harley was sleeping in as Ivy got comfortable and fell asleep. Hours later, the sun had finally set as Poison Ivy slowly began to stir before waking up, not having remembered going to sleep. Looking around, Ivy found herself sleeping beside Harley and realized that Ash had put her here when she finally couldn't stay awake any longer. She laid back down as she relaxed, still feeling the effects of staying up all night. "How are you feeling?" came Ash's voice as he walked in with a tray carrying a pot of tea, 2 cups, and a variety of sweeteners she had on hand. "Better, I hope?" Sitting up, Poison Ivy rested against the headboard as Ash placed the tray on her lap. Gently grabbing the teapot, Ash poured Ivy some tea before handing her the cup as he said, "I don't know what you like, so I thought it safe to simply bring what I could find, and you add in what you like yourself." "Thank you," Ivy said as she grabbed the bottle of natural agave nectar before adding a good helping to her tea and stirring it with one of the available spoons. Though, realizing something, she asked, "Why are there 2 cups and 2 spoons?" At this, Ash turned his head slightly in her direction, having moved to the side where Harley was as he said, "Well, I think it's only fair that I bring a cup for our patient who should be waking up right around this time." At this, Ivy's eyes widened as she quickly put her cup of tea, along with the tray, on the bedside table before turning to look at Harley as she saw her slowly stirring awake. She watched as Harley's face contorted slightly in discomfort as she lightly groaned before her eyes began to flutter, one of them being a little swollen still from her fall a few days ago. She watched as Harley looked around for a second before her own eyes widened, or as much as they could, and tried to shoot up, only for Ash to hold her down gently as he calmly said, "Easy now, you're still very banged, no need to make any sudden movements." "Where am I? Who are you?" Harley exclaimed, not recognizing where she was. "Harles, calm down," Ivy said gently, getting Harley to look at her in surprise. "Red?" Harley asked, realizing she was in her friend's home and calming down. "What's going on?" "You don't remember?" Ivy asked with worry evident on her face. "Ash said he found you in the rubble of several broken crates and trash after hearing a crash." Hearing this, Harley tried to think about what had happened and remember what they were talking about. However, suddenly, images began rapidly flashing in her mind before she held her head with her hands, or as best she could with one being in a cast, as her head began hurting. I can't," Harley gritted out, her head hurting beyond compare as the harder she tried, the more her head hurt. Seeing this, Ash placed his hand on Harley's shoulder as he said, "It's okay, take a breath and relax." Hearing his voice, Harley slowly began to calm down as her breathing slowed and evened out. While she laid back as she asked, "Why can't I remember?" "It's perfectly normal for you to not remember," Ash said as he fixed her blanket, covering her up to her waist while her arms rested on top. "When one survives an incident that causes heavy physical damage, your mind will repress the memory of the event and what led up to it to protect your psyche. You'll remember eventually, just not right away." I hope so," Harley groaned. "I want to pay back whoever did this to me." "And you will," Ivy said as she sat next to Harley, helping her drink some tea she'd poured for her, which Harley gratefully sipped. "But right now, you need to focus on getting better." Sigh. Harley sighed as she knew her best friend was right and that right now, she wasn't going to be of any help to anyone or do anything for a while. Taking this moment, she looked at the third member in the room, curious about him. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why had he saved her? What the hell was he wearing? Seeing her staring at Ash, Ivy said, "It's all right, he's a friend." "Can we trust him, Red?" Harley whispered to Ivy, I mean, do you even know who he is or what he looks like under that suit? 'Cause there's no way that's what he looks like. Looking at Ash for a second, Ivy understood what Harley was saying. She hardly knew anything about their mysterious guest besides his name and that he was highly skilled with his scythes. She didn't know if he was actually friendly, if he was using them, or even if he was actually a psychopath playing a friendly face, if she could even call it that, waiting for the opportunity to kill them in any manner of horrible ways. However, at the same time, he'd gone out of his way to help Harley, retrieved necessary medical supplies, and even helped take care of both of them when she was too tired to stay standing. But, of course, no psychopath or anyone who wasn't truly a kind person would do any of that, as they'd likely watch out for themselves over anything else. I don't think he's a bad person, Ivy said with a look that said she held little doubt about her decision. He helped and took care of you when all of this happened. He even got the supplies needed to take care of you when we ran out. Not to mention, if he had wanted to hurt us, he could have done so a long time ago, as he's had more than enough time. So yeah, while I don't know what he looks like or what his real name might be, I have no doubt that he's only here to help us. She might not know who he is or what he looked like, but Ivy just had this feeling that no matter how little she knew about him, or how mysterious he seemed, she trusted that Ash would never hurt them. With that, Ivy got up from the bed as she went to the kitchen to see about making something Harley could eat with Ash's help, as the last time he'd cooked, it had been a disaster, and she'd prefer it not happen again. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.